o'clock, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission will initiate its afternoon session on mission change rulemaking. We are undertaking the consideration of the 400 rule series, the operations rules. We had staff presentation this morning, and we're going to hear from parties this afternoon. Ms. Larson should be identifying our first panel, which is a subset of the industry parties. So we will get you on board once you're all ready. Whomever's going to lead off, unmute yourself, and then I'll call on you and we'll get you going. As I mentioned to the world at large, my lunch was yet another experience of not eating lunch. So I'm going to unvideo myself so that you don't have the pleasure of watching me eat my tuna fish sandwich, but I will be here listening to all of you. Mr. Matthews, I'll pick on you because you're the only one who's videoed himself. Do you know who's going to lead off for industry?
Yes, Chair Robbins. I think Mr. Neslin is going to, and we have a couple of witnesses following Mr. Neslin's introduction.
And Mr. Neslin, if you're in the meeting, could you raise your hand? I apologize. I'm not finding you at the moment.
I didn't see Mr. Neslin in the meeting either. Is he calling in on a phone maybe?
I don't have that information. Let's see.
He's here. We're searching.
You know,
for a way to get him on.
tell them that I'll re-enter Zoom.
Yep. He's re-entering Zoom. I don't, if you were able to hear that.
Yeah, we were. Thank you, Mr. Nowicki. We'll wait for Mr. Neslin to re-enter Zoom, and then we'll find him and get him make him a panelist. Well, so far, Neslin's presentation is brilliant.
Okay, I believe Mr. Neslin has joined and we've just made him a panelist. Mr. Neslin, you're there, but I believe you're muted. There you are.
There I go. Can you hear me, commissioners?
We can hear you.
All right. Sorry about the technological problems. I'm Dave Neslin, appearing on behalf of the First Industry Group this afternoon. We believe that the 400 series rules issued on August 17th reflect significant improvements over prior drafts, move towards consensus, and we commend the staff and the other stakeholders for their work on this series. We will present 3 witnesses, Justin Caskey, David Nowicki, and Brian Kasher, who will make specific suggestions to further improve the requirements for noise, lighting, odors, and dust. And 1 witness, Chelsea Miera, to address specific West Slope issues. 2 other quick points. First, in the interest of efficiency, we will not offer testimony on Rule 411, but we support the testimony that Great Western will provide later. Second, several industry parties have questioned how Rules 423 through 427 regarding surface impacts should apply in those jurisdictions which separately regulate those impacts. We'll address that subject during the 200 series rules in connection with Rule 201. Mr. Caskey, please go ahead.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. My name is Justin Caskey. I am an acoustical engineer based out of Calgary, Alberta. I have 17 years of experience in environmental acoustics, focused on compliance assessments for oil and gas noise sources. I wanted to offer some brief comments on a noise study cited by Adams County in their pre-hearing statement, specifically their Exhibit 2, which was a noise study summarizing a long-term monitoring assessment around a well pad. The pre-hearing statement for Adams County suggests lowering the permissible noise level targets in Rule 423 and cites this noise study as a basis for their suggestion. The study referred to includes features that may limit its use as a basis for setting regulatory permissible noise levels. Specifically, the continuous monitoring study included several months of data and had no way of determining the source of the sounds captured. The consequence of this is that the data set presented contained noise sources from oil and gas operations, as well as other community noise sources like traffic and aircraft, wind, animals, etc. All of which can produce elevated levels on both C scale and A scale noise. In my view, the results of this study were skewed by these other noise sources. The study did include attempts at managing this type of contamination during the noise study. And in my experience, the methods deployed to limit this contamination from other noise sources were inadequate. In addition, the study references other research sources as a basis for recommending lower permissible noise levels and does not relate the noise study results to this other research source directly. In my view, the contents or the context of the recommendation to lower the permissible noise levels to 55 dBc matters a great deal, and the noise study presented does not give rationale or context for this recommendation. My conclusion is that the noise study cited by Adams County is useful because it includes several months of sound data to capture a wider range of conditions. However, this extended study also introduces a larger range of other environmental noise sources not related to oil and gas operation. The study also included other limitations, skewing the results upward. As a result, in my opinion, the noise study cited by Adams County would not be useful for setting regulatory levels. Thank you. That was my brief statement. Happy to answer any questions you have. And I believe David's next. Correct?
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, so let me pull that up. My name is David Nowicki, and I am testifying on behalf of Occidental in reference to the August 17th version of Rule 424, which we generally support with some modifications. I am an electrical engineer with over 30 years experience, 12 of which in oil and gas. I currently hold 16 state licenses to practice engineering. I am a member of the International Dark Sky Association, Illuminating Engineering Society, and NFPA. Site lighting is an engineered system. Artificial light serves a purpose and is required for safe and accurate execution of a task. The term mitigation assumes lighting is a problem, but if lighting is done correctly, a mitigation plan is not required. For example, is a mitigation plan required when you drive down a road and there's a street light to indicate to turn off, or a light on the side of your house which delineates the edge of a building? In 424A, the term mitigation should be removed such that the rule requires a lighting plan. 424A also states that all lighting mitigation plans be signed by a person with relevant experience. Engineered systems are covered under existing state laws. Therefore, this requirement should be removed. The next question I would pose is, does the proposed rule support or act in concert with known standards such as Osha or sound engineering principles? In some instances, the answer is no, and 424 requires some modification and clarification. The use of the phrase ensure safety as employed in the draft rule in instances where the rule is subjective. The term ensure means to make certain or to guarantee. This is an issue to a professional engineer because it guarantees an outcome of a complex subject. The following slides show red line revisions we propose. 424B employs the phrase, no light shines above a horizontal plane. The no light is technically infeasible and not descriptive of the behavior of light. Light scatters, it reflects. Therefore, we request the modification of the wording. 424B lists BMPs for operators. There are several techniques that could be used to minimize lighting when not needed. The use of color that reduce light intensity should only be required where feasible to still perform the task safely. I would ask that the wording be modified to make such clarifications. 424C, the low values of illuminance 2,000 feet from a facilities are arbitrary in nature and do nothing to promote or identify constraints of a lighting design. We recommend they be removed in favor of reviewing impacts of lighting to adjacent areas. 424D, with the use of noise barrier and fully shielded fixtures, exterior lights below the noise barrier are not visible and should not be considered in the total lumen calculations. 424F should be deleted because measurement to a specific source is technically not feasible or applicable. This rule also does nothing to promote safety or minimize light pollution. In summary, Occidental's recommendation of setting a limit of the amount of lumens per square foot of working pad space is in the spirit of the best current practices for health, safety, and environmental compliance. We request Rule 424 be modified accordingly as shown on the preceding slides. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Brian.
I'm going to share my screen as well. My name is Brian Koshier, and I am testifying on behalf of PDC Energy, where I work as a senior asset engineer. I am testifying today on issues related to lighting, odors, and dust, and in general support of draft rules 424, 426, and 427, with a few exceptions. I would first like to start with Rule 426 odors. In the DJ Basin along the Front Range, operators have shifted to the utilization of oil-based mud for a multitude of added benefits. For this, the operator will develop best management practices to mitigate against any potential impacts within their odor mitigation plan. I'm concerned with the language in Rules 426C 1 through 7, in which best management practices are specified. Best management practices do not belong within the rules. Rather, the onus is on the operator to develop site-specific BMPs for each location that will be submitted within the Form 2A. Including best management practices within the rules is problematic in that it limits technology and innovation to mitigate against potential impacts. As these practices will be within the rules and can only be removed with the subsequent rulemaking, for these reasons, we recommend removing 426C in its entirety. My next concern is with some of the aspects within Rule 424 lighting. I am in full support of David Nowicki's testimony with some additional input. First, Rule 424A2AI requires the lighting plan to include the anticipated location, mounting height, and orientation of all outdoor lighting fixtures during pre-production activities. This will be impossible for an operator to comply with at the time of permitting. Permit submittal can be at a time frame 2 to 3 years prior to pre-production activities commencing. An operator would not be able to identify which drilling rig or frac fleet would be executing the work. Rigs and fleets can have unique footprints and lighting installed to ensure worker safety. Operators only provide portable lighting that could be moved depending on the operation being conducted to ensure the safety of personnel. This requirement will lead to unnecessary paperwork for both the staff and the operator through a Form 4 sundry and should be omitted. My next concern is with the cumulative light impacts in 424F of limiting light intensity from an oil and gas location to 4 lux from any building unit within 1 mile of the location. Let's go back to an area that we are familiar with in Erie that has been referenced this past week. As you can see, the 1 mile radius around the Waste Connections oil and gas location covers an area of over 3 square miles, which encompasses various land use applications such as residential, landfills, a golf course, and even an airport. Based on this rule, a measurement can be taken from the western side of this area from a building unit bordering the airport towards the Waste Connections pad. This measurement would account for all lighting impacts, including airport lights, porch lights, street lights, headlights, and traffic lights in its path and have a cumulative effect. The proposed oil and gas location will include a lighting plan quantifying lumen output and orientation of lights, in addition to a qualitative analysis indicating whether the lights will be on, switches, and sensors, meaning they will be only on when a personnel is on location. The way this rule is crafted, a light measurement can be taken from the building unit bordering the airport, accounting for all the impacts of the residential community and commercial development, and deemed above the 4 lux threshold, even if the permanent fixtures at the oil and gas facility are off. The table in 424D2 explicitly states the limit for light impacts based on land use or zoning designation. Furthermore, the photometric plan to be included in 424A2B IV illustrates the illuminance impacts of the facility lighting. As the distance increases from the production facility, the impacts of the facility lighting lessens. Rule 424D2 is clear and measurable on the limits imposed to minimize impacts and protect. Therefore, section 424F should be omitted, as an oil and gas location can only be held to compliance of what it can control. As with cumulative impacts in lighting, the requirements in 427E, cumulative dust impacts, are impractical. For this exercise, we will be looking at the Coyote Trails location. As was indicated last week, there are multiple operators in this area. Accounting for truck traffic at another operation is not feasible. The oil and gas location that will be analyzed for dust impacts accounts for less than 0.5% of the land use in the area. There is a variety of land use, from residential, multiple landfills covering almost 2 square miles, commercial, and heavy construction activity in the building of subdivisions. Dust is highly transient, and the source of the impacts can be very difficult to determine. An operator can only mitigate the area of the proposed location, and accounting for impacts on the other 99.5% of the land use in the area is problematic. Therefore, we suggest 424E be omitted. The operator is required to prepare and submit a dust mitigation plan that outlines BMPs and demonstrates the operator is properly mitigating dust impacts for an oil and gas location. Regulations need to set standards that are not only protective, but measurable for compliance. We are not asking for less protective measures. I will repeat, we are not asking for less protective measures, but rather, just as the changes outlined be made, to ensure compliance can be measured, holding the operator responsible to the protective plans submitted within the Form 2A. And with that, I will pass off to Chelsea Mira with West Slope Koga.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Robbins, commissioners, and staff. I'm Chelsea Mira, the Executive Director for West Slope COGA. I'll be highlighting a few important remaining West Slope issues, and if you wouldn't mind pausing our time for one moment, I will share my screen as well.
You are paused.
Try to do this the right way. Wonderful, you should be able to see it now.
We do.
First, West Slope COGA believes the draft rules approach with respect to odor mitigation plans should be expanded to equally noise, lighting, and dust mitigation plans. Specifically, the existing statement of basis and purpose acknowledges that operations not in proximity to any inhabited dwellings, and I quote, are very unlikely to pose odor-related concerns, and therefore an odor management plan may be unnecessary for those locations. West Slope COGA suggests similar language be added in the statement of basis and purpose for noise, lights, and dust. Just as with odor impacts, West Slope COGA believes that impact mitigation plans designed to protect the welfare of nearby residents should not be required if there are no nearby residents to be impacted. Mitigation plans should be focused on where they will add value on those locations where the plans would affect public welfare. Second, West Slope COGA understands and agrees with the goal of ensuring rural areas stay relatively quiet. That's right. It's the reason so many move to these areas, myself included. However, rural areas throughout the state are themselves diverse and differ greatly related to activity and expectations for noise. A stringent one-size-fits-all approach for rugged backcountry locations in our state is not the most effective solution for the temporary noise associated with development. We believe a better approach to ensuring appropriate noise regulations in remote areas is to allow the local governments to have more say in developing these limits. They understand their rural residents' desires, and they understand the land uses allowed in their communities. West Slope COGA understands that Rule 423B3C provides a potential pathway for a local government to agree with a higher noise level, but in rural areas, this should go slightly further. To ensure this, West Slope COGA desires the language I have shared on my screen be added to the end of Rule 423B3C. Finally, and I will touch briefly on Rule 411, West Slope COGA is concerned that some of the constituents listed in either Table 411-1 or Table 915-1 are often naturally occurring in both the soils and produced water on the West Slope. We appreciate ongoing efforts between parties to come to consensus-based solutions, and we support the efforts you will hear from Great Western in a moment. West Slope COGA's 900 series pre-hearing statement discusses in detail constituents listed in both tables and provides examples. To more accurately reflect our true operating conditions, West Slope COGA proposes the following streamlined language update to 411B6 that you see on your screen. I will send these suggested language changes to Ms. Larson for your consideration. I'd be remiss if I didn't close by stating our appreciation to staff adding language to the statement of basis and purpose, clarifying that all current spacing orders, including the one applicable to the Bmps Basin, remain in effect. Thank you for your time today, and I'll pass it back to Mr. Neslin.
Thank you, commissioners. That concludes our testimony. We're happy to answer questions.
Thank you, panel, for that good information. I'm not sure why I've got an echo. I think you can hear me now without problems. Good. Okay, we now have an opportunity for commissioners to ask questions of this panel. I will look to my fellow, I've got a couple of questions, but I'll look to my fellow commissioners first if you've got questions for the panel. Commissioner Gonzalez, you're moving toward your computer.
Sure. I'm just trying to get these questions dialed in. It was a lot of information, a lot of language suggestions without being able to kind of see it to refer back to. So if I missed something, if I misstated, please forgive me and correct me along the way. Just want to get to the bottom of everything. There was a comment by, I believe, Mr. Nowicki about lighting mitigation assumes lighting is a problem. I think what we're trying to get here is the impact of lighting, not necessarily the problem of lighting. And I'm sure you would recognize that lighting has an impact on the surrounding environment. And so I'm curious about why that impact shouldn't be mitigated.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I appreciated that. The term mitigation to me means that you are responding to an identified issue. If someone asks for a mitigation plan, I would look at what I'm trying to mitigate, whether it be light pollution, maybe the effects of lighting on a migration of a certain species of animal. So the term as a catch-all, mitigation, implies that there is an identified issue. I would look that, yes, we want to assess the impacts, but not necessarily assume they require mitigation, that they serve a purpose and that we minimize the amount that it impacts. So it's more of a wording kind of thing, but when somebody says mitigation, I think it is responding to an issue. I hope that answers your.
I mean, I understand your answer. Not quite sure. I'm convinced that the mitigation plan wouldn't, one, identify the potential impacts and then offer potential mitigations. But that'll be left for our deliberations. Can I ask you a question about the no light shines above a horizontal plane and this being infeasible? Could you explain that just a little bit? When I think about light, I think about it kind of going everywhere. And so I'm trying to figure out what your, how best to maybe reframe what we're trying to accomplish if there's an opportunity to do so.
Oh, thank you again, Counselor. Yes, that's light scatters, it deflects, especially on these types of fixtures. It's non-coherent. Light from a laser is coherent, so it has a defined edge. Here, light will scatter, it will reflect, it'll go above the light to a certain degree. The best you can do is minimize that light pollution as it reflects up. So here you would have something like both the fixture itself that you would consider, the surface that it's reflecting off of, and that you would look to minimize those impacts in the upward direction in order to minimize the effects on the dark sky and the scatter that it creates. But light is, it's a wily thing. It reflects, it diffuses, it bounces, and it's non-coherent is a technical term.
Thank you.
Any follow-up, Commissioner Gonzalez?
Not at the moment. Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to the person who referenced the Adams County noise study, are you all supportive of the decibels that are in the draft rule 423?
Yeah, I could speak to that. The red line in the, I think it was the June 20 or July 26th draft of the 423. Yeah, API and the members are supportive of that language in there currently. Yes.
So sorry, I have the August one in front of me. Did it change from June to August? I don't see red line through it, so I think they're the same numbers.
Okay, and I'm not sure about that. I see some heads shaking, so I don't think there's been changes since July.
Mr. Cashier?
Alan, I can jump in. We are in full support of the table within Rule 423 noise that was issued on August 17th.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
So I am sympathetic to the argument of not being able to control what other folks do. So the dust that comes from other sources, the light that comes from other sources. But we are tasked with figuring out cumulative impacts per the mission change for Senate Bill 181. And so I'm just curious to know what an alternative thought would be from industry to figure out what the cumulative impact would be from adding those activities from an operator, knowing that obviously that you can't control what the airport's doing or what the street lights are doing. Somehow we need to marry those two concepts. And so I'm not sure that just getting rid of cumulative impact is gonna meet our mission that we're tasked with as part of Senate Bill 181. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Thanks, Commissioner McGowan. And I don't envy the position that this commission is in, because it is very tough. If we look at noise, even air emissions, light, odor, and dust. Noise and air monitors are quantifiable. The monitors are placed between the source of either noise and emissions and between the receptor. The data is continuous for VOCs and in real time, just as it is in noise. So we can quantify the cumulative impacts of an oil and gas operation to the area because we have an ambient study that you can determine what is cumulative. Obviously there's some problematic issues with that as well, where if an oil and gas operation commences pre-production activity in the drilling and completion, and a subdivision starts getting built across the street, it's still tough to quantify the impacts of each. But it's real-time data that you can submit and evaluate and mitigate based on that data. The odor and dust, it's an ambient impact, or it's a transient impact. And as Mr. Nowicki said, lighting has its technical issues as well. Really, the way I see it is that's why we have these plans associated with dust, odor, and light, in that it's not quantitative data, it's rather a qualitative analysis of the potential impacts to the surrounding and how we can use that to describe what our plans will be to mitigate against those. For dust, is it applying non-potable water to the location twice a day, or is it 3 times a day? And that'll be outlined within the plans. Same thing with odor. With using oil-based mud, yes, there's an odor to it, but we can alleviate some of that potential impact by changing the base fluids for that mud, orienting the rig away from potential stakeholders that may be impacted. So for those, I see that as part of the cumulative plan and qualitative analysis. So I still think the mandates of 181 are being recognized. And what's particularly, as we saw with the Coyote Trails location, where it made up 0.5% of the land use within that 1 mile radius, which is 3.1 miles squared. It's really tough to quantify where the impacts are coming from based on the transient, how transient air and odor and dust can be. For that, I feel like, as far as the land use perspective, that's probably where the local government or, the BLM is probably more equipped to deal with those nuisance mitigations, because, they regulate land use on all land use applications, from, the application, the approval, and also, the regulation of those nuisances. So, they can account for, all of the land use in that area. And for that, that's where in our pre-hearing statements, we offered a red line with 422, and Kim Mendoza-Cook written testimony with Oxy supports that, in that we believe in 422, it should state that the relevant local government, if it regulates, noise, dust, odor, and light, should have deference to that regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. McGowan.
So I think the other problem that I'm having is, I think that you also said in your testimony that some of these plans, you're not going to be able to supply some of the required information because it's too early, because you're not going to know what kind of equipment you're going to be using. You don't know the exact schematic or the traffic, what kind of access you're going to road you're going to have, etc. And so back to earlier in the day when I'm really struggling with the use of these plans as a meaningful tool for community to understand what's going to be coming potentially to their neighborhood. And I don't know if that requires an answer from you all, but it feels very chicken and egg to me, and I'm struggling with it. And then I guess my other comment is, we can't control what others do, but we can control what we do. And so we need to really, I think, I'm going to age myself here, but if you all remember the saying, for recycling, you got to think globally, but act locally. We have to be responsible for our own actions, because those are the things that we control in our sphere of influence. And so while the airport light may have been existing before, if I'm a neighbor, oil and gas operations moving in did not exist before, and it is going to have an impact on my quality of life, and it is going to have an impact on what I see, what I smell, what I hear. And so I think that we want to be really thoughtful about the impact that that has on a neighborhood.
Oh, Commissioner McGowan, I completely agree. We don't want to minimize any potential impact that we may impose. As far as the permit time frame, that was in particular to the requirement to submit lighting on a drilling rig or a frac fleet in the orientation and height of those lights. The reason why that's very difficult for us is, we don't own the equipment of the drilling rig or the frac fleet. We third party them, and the basis of those contracts, are either yearly per well or what have you. So for us to be able to identify which particular rig or frac fleet we're going to be executing the work with and have exact heights, orientations, the lights on the site, it would be extremely difficult and impossible, because we don't know what rigs or frac fleets we're going to have in 2 to 3 years. That doesn't mean the level of protection would change, but the specificity of orientation and height would. One of the solutions we offered is that, similar to in Rule 423 noise, the ambient noise survey is due 30 to 90 days prior to the commencement of pre-production activities. So I feel if we incorporated that into the rule, we can provide that, because 30 to 90 days out, we're going to know which drilling rig or frac fleet's going to be going there, and we can provide that and show the level of protection. Furthermore, I want to get to your second point, to control what we can do, I believe is what you said. I was trying to describe very fast. And that's exactly what the plans would be, is identifying the potential impacts to the stakeholders and how we're going to control those and how we're going to mitigate those in action levels that will shift that plan. So I understand it's very tough, because you have to quantify cumulative impacts, but in a lot of these mitigations, there isn't a way to quantify the data, but the plan would be how we control what we do. I hope that answers your question or concerns at least.
Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yep. And I would just like to, sorry.
Go ahead, Mr. Nowicki, if you want to add.
I would just like to
then we'll
comment
go to
briefly on that. As a professional engineer and licensed in the state of Colorado, I am personally liable for the designs and execution of a design for things that I produce. And it's a personal liability, and it's insured for part of the agreement with the public. And submitting something so early would, first of all, I can't assure that would be the exact execution of the design. So safety, mitigation, or to a known standard or impacts, it becomes very nebulous and subjective to that. So I don't envy you in having to try to weed through how that looks in order for to do what you say, to put forward a proposal 3 years in advance or 2.5 years in advance, and then execute to that standard. In a lot of states now, they're requiring that professional engineers provide assurances that the design was executed accordingly and that construction was completed to those standards. So thank you for that, Commissioner Gowan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nowicki. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a quick follow-up, and then I'll let Commissioner Njapa and Commissioner Messner jump in, because I know they have questions as well. What I can understand the concern with the plans, the mitigation plans being so far out ahead of the actual operation, and the possibilities of things changing with specifics, specifically in regard to the types of equipment that are being used. So I get that. Now, what I'm wondering is, and this is a question I asked staff, if anyone was listening to that, was, would the operator have the opportunity to identify kind of potential scenarios and really break those out for what they anticipate, could be possibilities that they use. And so the question I have is, if you guys are thinking about your rig schedule 3 years out, are there opportunities to say this general type of rig or these general components of a type of rig would allow for this type of mitigation?
And these general components of this type of rig would allow for this type of mitigation. And be able to identify, at least at a higher level, that you could capture most of those scenarios on the front end and save you from having to, to sundry on the back end. I'm trying to find where maybe there might be some middle ground here.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. To that question, a lot of the mitigation plans, yes, we can. For instance, noise mitigation plan. We have a general idea of the footprint of a drilling rig, and you can orient it in ways to mitigate against the surrounding stakeholders. Same thing with a frac fleet, and you can incorporate that into a noise mitigation plan. You also work with the local governments and understand future developments coming in, and at the time of permitting, 2-3 years out, maybe there's just farmland around, but there might be a subdivision that'll be there during the time of operations. So we can develop plans like that. Same thing with dust. We'll know our footprint, we'll know our access road, and we can certainly tailor a plan around that. Same thing with odor to that extent. But really the tough one, as Mr. Nowicki said, is lighting. Rigs, for instance, there's 6 or 7 different, companies that offer rigs. Each one of those companies has different series of rigs, and the lighting is highly variable. So it's just, that becomes the difficult nature of it, is providing that portion. And, I suggested in the verbal testimony to just omit it. But like I said, I think if we tailor it to similar to the noise, with the ambient survey taking 30 to 90 days. And the reason why that ambient survey is taking 30 to 90 days before pre-production activities is just for that. At the time of permitting, there might be, like I said, just farmland and ranch land around. By the time activity gets there might be, we live in the Front Range where there's, mass development and population growth. By the time the activity gets there, the subdivisions may be around and different roads. So that's why that ambient survey has shifted to pre-production. In the previous series of rules, I believe it was back in the March 15th iteration, that it was at the time of permitting, and that was something we worked on. But I would suggest that would be a potential solution if we wanted to see the orientation of drilling rigs and frac fleets, having language in there, 30 to 90 days prior to activity.
Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for the testimony. I do have a few questions and a couple of comments. I think first, I think these are good discussions about the different submittals and the different plans, and certainly trying to get everyone's head around the need to provide mitigation plans for dust and odor and noise and lighting. As I'm reading the rules in the different sections, I think what I'm often seeing is the words, anticipated and proposed, right? And so in those scenarios, what you're basically submitting for a plan is, this is what we think is going to work. And this is a concept. This is, something that we intend to move forward with. It doesn't necessarily mean it's it's not as specific as I think maybe some of you are interpreting it as. Having been a county commissioner and reviewed a number of applications within Gunnison County that actually utilize these types of plans, my experience is that you're anticipating and proposing something, and this is standard land use stuff, right? So if you're doing a subdivision, if you're doing a gravel pit, if you're doing any kind of land use things, you're typically submitting plans like this, and you're anticipating what you're needing, you're anticipating what the plan is. Certainly this is common practice in the lighting industry. And, most subdivision, most land use changes require a lighting plan, and they require you to anticipate what you're going to be utilizing, but it may change in the end. And there's typically, provisions within land use codes that would allow for some modifications of the plan based on, what is going to happen on the ground. And I think that the rules as proposed certainly contemplate that as well. So I think my point here is that at least the way that I read it, I'm not actually seeing the submittal saying, if you don't do this exactly the way that you propose it, then you can't do it. That's not what I'm seeing. What I'm seeing is, this is your anticipated plan. This is how you're going to mitigate the situation. This is the proposed technology that's available right now that you could potentially use. This is how you're going to do full cutoff lighting. This is the general height of the lighting in order to make sure it's below your sound walls or below any kind of natural barriers to ensure that it's not going to be, spreading out over the pad, past the pad, or impact some of the, adjacent property owners. And so I think, I think just philosophically, I'm seeing a little bit of confusion there. And so I want to throw that out there and kind of get some thoughts on that, because I do think, and I brought this up when we were talking with staff about the 400 series, about this concept of, you're proposing something, and there is no question that you're proposing an anticipated plan. This is what we plan to utilize. And these are the circumstances in which we would utilize these. And these are the, how this is going to meet these, the mitigating these impacts. But as you get closer to it, it may come that, well, we're going to make an adjustment here. And if we can make an adjustment that is as protective or more protective than the initial concept, then that seems like that can get solved with a Form 4. If there's a significant change in the plan that potentially is less protective than what the initial plan was, then it becomes, a different level of modification to the 2A, and that becomes a little more problematic, right? But I'm assuming that most of these things that you're proposing are going to be captured within a Form 4, because what you will propose will be as protective or more protective than the initial plan was. And so I guess I'm curious to hear if you guys think I'm way off on this, or what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, Commissioner Mesner. I'll start off, and I think Mr. Nowicki will probably I don't want to speak for him, but maybe he'll want to add into as well. I just want to be clear. The only plan we have concerns with the time frame is the lighting plan. We feel like we can execute the other plans associated with the 400 series at the time of permitting. And like you said, it's a basis of how we're going to mitigate and be protective. The concern I have with lighting is that time frame, that yes, we can qualitatively explain how we're going to be protective and minimize the impacts to the stakeholders. But when you have a definitive diagram with orientations, light angles, heights, lumen outputs that know with almost certainty that 90 to 95% are going to be inaccurate at the time of execution of that plan, and just leads, in our mind, just unnecessary Form 4 sundries for not only the operator, but the staff. It's a lot of paperwork coming in. Every location is going to have to be sundried. And that's why I think if we just take out that portion of it and move it to, like I said, similar to the ambient noise survey, based on a duration before the pre-production activity, then we can certainly provide all the data. But within the plan itself, it'll outline the protective, how the pre-production activities will be protective. It just won't have the specifics. So in analyzing a 2A, you're still going to be able to understand the protection and understand where the stakeholders are surrounding this location. It's just not going to have the specificity of exact lighting. But that will be provided at the time, like I said, before pre-production, and then then it'll still go through staff determination of whether that is more at least as protective or more protective than the Form 2A.
Mr. Nowicki?
Yep. Thank you, Commissioner Messenger. I appreciate that comment, and I want to think about that a little bit myself. As an engineer, what I say and what I do needs to align, especially when it deals with the public. Anything that's released to the public, I take with a great deal of solace. That's my bond. So when I think about that, I understand the context of what you're trying to say. And in certain instances, those are very prescribed kinds of systems, right? a light on the side of a house, a warehouse, those kinds of things. Here we're talking about a drilling rig facility that may or may not be from the same vendor. It may be different. So I need to think about in terms of what we, it kind of mimics what Commissioner McGowan was kind of talking about, whereas when I say something to the public or release it as a public statement, I want it to be accurately and reflect what that is that we're doing it to the closest level possible. And that's just part of my makeup. So that's how I'd like to leave that in that context. I do want to think about it some more. I think your comments are well received on my end, but I think about it in terms of, sealing documents, as an engineer. So thank you.
Sure. And I appreciate those responses. Mr. Chair, if it's okay, I have a couple other questions. And I think this probably is best pointed at Ms. Mira. So a lot of the folks here today are talking about impacts when it comes to residents, but you seem to indicate, at least what I'm hearing, is that because some of the operations that happen on the western slope do not have direct impacts necessarily to residents, and so should have lesser restrictions around those. And I guess my initial question to you is, do you acknowledge that, noise, light, and perhaps even dust have impacts to wildlife resources, biological resources on the western slope, even if we're not around residents?
Absolutely, Commissioner, and thank you for the question. Of course, we want to ensure our wildlife on the West Slope, we all value greatly over here, is protected. And that's why West Slope COGA advocated for and supports Rule 423B4, which requires the COGCC to consult with CPW and BLM if on federal lands to determine acceptable noise levels and monitoring protocols when operating near wildlife. We believe this rule requires technical expertise and determines noise limits on a site-specific basis on potentially impacted wildlife. We've even gone as far with some of our operators to conduct some noise studies to be sure that those mitigation efforts are appropriate and as least impactful to our wildlife as possible. Did that answer your question, Commissioner?
No, I mean, certainly you acknowledge the fact that noise and lighting and dust, have, and dust, I'm pointing more towards some biological resources, but I do think that actually there's the potential for noise and lighting to have more impact to wildlife, and more significant, maybe even requires lesser benchmarks depending on where the particular site is located, within the state, and certainly with migratory patterns for big game habitat, as well as sensitive habitat and these types of things. And so I do acknowledge that the consultation with CPW is a critical step in that, and so certainly support that. But I do struggle with kind of a blanket, let's make it less restrictive because it's not around people. And so
and I can read that, Commissioner, and I don't think that we're looking for necessarily just a blanket less restriction. I think that we would like to be sure that those impacts are data-based and the mitigations then are appropriate based on those site specifics. And so I think that those on-sites become more and more valuable.
That's all the questions. No, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Other commissioners with questions for this panel? Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just acknowledging, I just want to make sure we're all clear on kind of what a baseline might be here, but acknowledging the potential inconvenience and uncertainty associated with some of the mitigation rules as they're currently drafted. Does industry have any concerns with their ability to operate safely and responsibly within the rules as they're drafted?
Sorry, Commissioner Gonzalez, I'm Dave Neslin here. We had some very unfortunate IT issues in the middle of this, and my computer is out of order at this point. So no, we don't have any issues of being protective the way the current rules are drafted. I mean, that's what we strive to do as an industry, that even before these rules. So to me, these are in line with the way the industry operates, and we're very proud of how we operate and are protective of the surroundings, environment, health, safety, and welfare, and wildlife resources. So no, we have no issues with the protectiveness of the rules.
Thanks for that clarification.
Brian,
I would
can
like,
you, Brian,
I would
can
like
you
to
state?
comment briefly on that.
Yeah, give me just a
There's
sec.
two areas that I would look at. One is the level of intensity of light to perform a task, right? The lighting required will have to match the acuity of the task. So threading pipe is different than being able to walk to your car or having a path. So there are some safety impacts in lighting. In addition, with color, there are some tasks in pattern recognition or in label reading or things like that, where wires, for instance, where different colors need to go to different connection points. You need to be able to accurately read that color. So there are some impacts, but they all could be, once they're understood and what the tasks are required in that area, they could all be designed, so to speak, into the solution for that. So that would be my only comment regarding that.
Thank you.
So the previous speaker was not Dave Neslin, it was Brian, right? I just want to clarify the record on that front. And Brian, I don't know.
Yes, Brian Kushner with PDC Energy on the previous.
Thank you. My attorney general would have wanted me to clarify the record, as I'm sure that's an important part of it. Other questions for this panel from commissioners? Commissioner Messner, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I missed one, and this is for Mr. Cucchieri. And I'm trying to remember what I quickly wrote down a question here, so I apologize in advance. But in 426, you indicated that you didn't want to see some of the specificity in that particular rule, and I think it was 426, when it comes to certain technologies utilized around odors. And it does indicate in there that it may include but not limited to these particular things. And I think my thought is that made sense, because it would at least give operators an idea of some, potential best management practices that they could utilize, but certainly didn't prohibit any additional technologies that could be implemented. But I guess, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. My thought is that BMPs don't belong in the rule language. That the onus is on the operator within their odor mitigation plan to identify the potential impacts and develop BMPs based on those impacts. So the operator will present that plan, and then it's director recommendation and commission approval. And it could be a denial if that plan isn't protective enough. The issue with BMPs is that kind of cements that point in time in the technology associated with mitigation within the rules. And to get those out, you simply have to have a rulemaking. And furthermore, one of the requirements or BMPs listed is the use of chillers. That is extremely concerning from an operational standpoint. Mud is a highly engineered system. Even the term mud may seem pretty crude, but it's a highly engineered system that has to achieve multiple things throughout the drilling of a wellbore. The mud is designed to bottom hole temperatures, to where when it's at that temperature, it'll have the properties needed to achieve protection of the wellbore, but also the personnel on location. So by chilling it at surface and then sending it down hole, it's just an operational concern that can lead to increased viscosities, the inability to transport cuttings to the surface, and create a higher downhole pressure environment that's unintended from the mitigation. So that's my only point, is that the operator is responsible for providing BMPs, and it doesn't belong in rule language.
Thank you, Mr. Koshne, for that answer. Commissioner Mesner, did you have follow-up?
No, I was just going to say thank you.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
Is there any benefit for these, stating some of these may but not limited to type BMPs to set a baseline for operators who may not be as protective, as innovative, as engaged maybe as PDC would be?
Mr. Koshne.
I understand there's optionality in the rule, but to me, like I said, it's just problematic including BMPs within the rule. And really, like I said, the onus should be on the operator to provide the protective BMPs that are necessary to mitigate.
Thank you. I think we might ask staff too on that point when we get back to staff. Other questions for commissioners?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Commissioner Nunjob.
Just a brief one, and thank you all for your comments and testimony. Just following up a little bit on some of the questions that Commissioner Messner and Commissioner Gonzalez asked. So to clarify, it's the concern with mitigation plans, especially in terms of lighting, for example, is just that there are going to be these multiple changes potentially. And so rather than trying to anticipate, you feel it's easier to do that later on. But I guess my question is there a particular hardship? Is it particularly onerous to fill out a Form 4, or is there an additional concern there in terms of the workload, the time, et cetera, the cost?
I just think it's creating work for both the staff and the operator that can be avoided, where the light mitigation plan itself at the time of submittal of the 2A can be extremely involved in how it'll be protective and indicate that. It's not the workload, it's just that it's a rule that'll lead to really, a Form 4 sundry in most cases. So, I don't want it to be thought that, we don't want to show our protection up front on the 2A, because you're tasked with making the decision of protecting that. So the plan will be completely explicit on how it will be protective. The specificity of orientation and height will change from the plan, but the level of protection will not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koshne, for that testimony. Other questions for this panel from commissioners? Seeing none, I think we can we thank this panel for their testimony. Appreciate Attorney Neslin giving up his computer for Mr. Koshne. I don't want that to be a reflection on the need or desire of attorneys, but we appreciate the testimony there. We will zoom this panel away and bring in the next industry panel into the House. And that panel, I think, also had set aside 30 minutes. This panel is comprised of Crestone, Great Western, High Point, Mallard, and Nickel Road.
Great, thank you. My name is Kelsey Wazelinski. I'm a shareholder with Jost Energy Law here on behalf of Great Western. For purposes of this presentation, I will be introducing Great Western's comments on Rule 411, followed by Ben Huggins and John Delaporte, who will expand on Great Western's position on Rule 411 and the protection of public water systems. Following John's testimony, Jason Oates of Crestone Peak will present on Rule 423 with respect to the regulation of noise. If Ms. Larson could please stop our time after John Delaporte's testimony on Rule 411 so that the commissioners can take any questions on the public water system rule before moving on to Jason Oates on Rule 423. it would be much appreciated, but we'll take your lead on that. We plan to reserve approximately 5 minutes of our 30-minute time allocation for closing statements. I'm going to share a PowerPoint, if you don't mind just giving me a minute to figure this out.
Okay, your time has stopped while you figure out your PowerPoint.
Can you all see this?
We can.
Great. I would like to start with a reiteration of the purpose of Rule 411. As stated in the draft statement of basis and purpose, this rule is not the exclusive commission rule to protect all water resources from all potential sources of contamination. This recognition is an important backdrop as you consider Rule 411 in the context of a robust regulatory framework that already protects water from contamination. You will hear from the Public Water Supplier Group tomorrow on their position on Rule 411. As acknowledged by Mr. Geronimo in his presentation, I would also like to acknowledge the collaborative approach that Great Western has taken to this rule with other industry parties. Commission staff, the CDPHE, DWR, and the Public Water Supplier Group to attempt to find consensus to the complex issues presented by this rule. As we will address today, we have made significant progress. However, several issues will be raised on this rule, specifically the Public Water Supplier Group's request to add recharge areas to the public water system buffers, which have presented recent challenges to reaching full consensus. With respect to any request to add recharge areas to the Rule 411 buffer zones, Great Western and other industry parties believe it is not possible to consider such a request when the locations of these areas tied to the public water supplies cannot yet be determined, and considering the intent of this rule to protect public water systems from potential threats caused by surface spills and releases. With that brief introduction, I will walk you through a few of the proposed changes that Great Western requests for this rule, keeping in mind that Great Western agrees with the majority of the rule language as of today. First, as Ben will address, we will request clarifying language in the statement of basis and purpose that the 3 proposed buffer zones, being classified water supply segments, Goody wells, and type 3 wells, be tied to approximate locations on a GIS map layer that will be regularly updated by the Commission so that the GIS map layer is as live as possible for these locations. This is critically important so that as new information becomes available for these 3 measurement points, the regulated community and the Commission understands where these points are located. Regular updates to the GIS layer will also facilitate meaningful notice and consultation with the public water supplier, which Great Western supports. With respect to specific rule language, Great Western acknowledges the proposed language in the rule that allows an operator to seek a variance from the Commission to operate within 1,000 feet of the internal buffer after consultation with the CDPHE and the public water supplier only if the protections the operator proposes are substantially equivalent to citing the location outside of the buffer zone. It is in this spirit of meaningful consultation that Great Western requests the following red line language in Rule 411 to allow operations within the 1,000-foot internal buffer zone of a surface water supply area, a Goody well, or a type 3 well only if a variance is granted by the Commission or a waiver is provided by the public water supplier. Great Western proposes that such a waiver will only be granted if the operator and the public water supplier agree that the proposed operations and applicable best management practices offer substantially equivalent protection of drinking water quality for surface water supply areas, Goody wells, or type 3 wells. If an agreement cannot be reached, then the operator cannot operate within the 1,000-foot internal buffer unless it is granted a variance by the Commission. I will now turn it over to Ben Huggins to expand on Great Western's comments to Rule 411.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben Huggins. I have been the EHS director for Great Western since 2016 and recently transitioned my role to contractor supporting Great Western in environmental health and safety matters. I would like to first and foremost express Great Western's support for the majority of proposed Rule 411 as revised in the August 17th draft. Great Western shares the goal of protecting public water resources and believes that proposed Rule 411 reflects that goal and codifies Great Western's existing internal requirements with respect to consultation and substantive protections of these water resources. When Rule 411 was first noticed in March, Great Western was concerned about our inability to identify the location of the proposed Goody well and PWS intake points. The vast majority of this data is non-public and highly confidential. Our initial review of proposed Rule 411 was also in the context of the fact that Great Western has been safely and protectively operating near the Brighton PWS, and we were concerned that expanded internal buffer zone from 300 feet to 1,000 feet was not based on technical data. Over the past several months, however, Great Western has been working productively and collaboratively with COGCC staff, CDPHE staff, and various stakeholders and rulemaking parties to work through the threshold issue of where the Goody wells and surface water supply areas are generally located. In addition, Great Western listened to the request by the Public Water Supplier Group to add Type 3 aquifer wells to Rule 411, and with the CDPHE and the COGCC staff, identified approximate locations where the Type 3 aquifer wells are located near existing public water supplies. We are encouraged by the COGCC's hard work on updating its GIS map layer that now show quarter-quarter sections within 1,000 feet of a Goody well and a Type 3 well, in addition to the current surface water supply area buffers. We believe that this updated map layer, coupled with the public water supplier's request for notice and consultation in the 300 series, which we support, resolves our concerns with identifying these specific locations. We do, however, request that the statement of basis and purpose outline the requirements by the COGCC to regularly update the GIS map layers as the specific PWS structures are updated, activated, or inactivated to ensure that we all understand what is being regulated by Rule 411. This is important because we found it to be an incredibly complex and time-consuming process to determine where the various proposed Rule 411 measurement points are located. If we do not know where the various intake points are located, we cannot meaningfully consult. As Kelsey outlined to you, we also propose one revision to the variance process to encourage and facilitate consultation with the public water supplier on operations within the 1,000-foot internal buffer zone. Great Western has had productive consultations with the City of Brighton through the course of our operations in the vicinity of the Brighton PWS, and this consultation has proven invaluable to ensure that the city and public water supplier understand our operations and that our operations continue to protect the Brighton PWS and associated water supply sources. In the spirit of facilitating consultation, we request that a process be built into Rule 411 to allow an operator and PWS to work together on proposed operation. If after that consultation, there is mutual agreement to allow the safe and protective operation within the internal buffer, the PWS should be able to waive the no operations requirement within 1,000 feet of a PWS structure without a mandated commission variance. Great Western's proposed waiver process would allow the operator and PWS to work together collaboratively on a proposed operation. Of course, if there's no agreement by the operator and the PWS, then there's no waiver and the operator can seek a variance from the commission. Ultimately, the protection of critical public water resources is our shared goal for this rule. We simply request that the rule expand on the PWS request for consultation and allow the operator and PWS an option to pursue a waiver only if the PWS and operator come to an agreement on the proposed operation in the internal buffer. Next slide, please. Or I believe it's the exhibit, excuse me. Next, I'll discuss our exhibits.
Yeah, sorry, my slide deck is not moving.
Let's pause the time. Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'll discuss a few of our exhibits included in your portfolio. The first is a process flow diagram, and this figure illustrates the process flow for a typical new Great Western facility near the PWS, including the wells, each stage of separation, production tanks, and each point in the process where pressure is monitored and controlled, as highlighted by the transducer icon in the figure. These pressure monitors and transducers have defined set points when they alarm to notify of abnormal pressures, as well as shutdowns where the well is automatically shut down due to abnormal pressures. These measures ensure that abnormal conditions are immediately identified and corrected. The next figure is our Stormwater Best Management Practices, or BMPs, diagram. It illustrates the BMPs and structures that Great Western utilizes at a typical new facility located near the Brighton PWS. It includes steel-lined secondary containment around production tanks, in our case sized to contain 200% or more of the volume of the largest primary vessel within that secondary containment. Perimeter ditch and berm, sized to convey the 100-year stormwater runoff flows. Automated fluid level monitoring to alert the operator in the event of sudden change in fluid level. Wells with remote shut-in capability. Continuous pressure monitoring on flow lines and gas lines with alerts. And air monitors for leak detection notification. With that, I will turn it over to John Delaporte, who will describe current spill prevention measures and BMPs that Great Western implements to protect all water resources, which further supports why a site-specific review of a proposed operation and our requested waiver process is so important. If after John's testimony you have any questions on Great Western's operations.
Can everybody hear me okay? The purpose of my testimony is to show how the oil and gas industry has effectively been using enhanced best management practices, or BMPs, to provide a substantially equivalent level of protection to public water systems. These enhanced BMPs protect surface water and groundwater resources, not only for surface water supply areas, but also for Goody wells and for Type 3 aquifer wells. I'll now briefly summarize the 3 existing industry regulatory protections for surface water and groundwater that supply public water systems. The COGCC regulations include the adopted wellbore integrity rules in the 200 and 600 rules, the baseline water quality and groundwater sampling rules in the 600 series, and the spill response regulations of the 900 series. At the federal level, the industry is covered under EPA's Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasures Rule, also known as the SPCC Rule. This SPCC rule requires that oil and gas production facilities inspect their tanks, conduct formalized tank integrity testing, and provide secondary containment adequately sized to capture the largest spill possible from a tank. Lastly, the Colorado Discharge Permit System provides for managing stormwater and preventing pollutants from traveling off-site. Per their stormwater permit, production facilities construct a perimeter stormwater ditch and berm, which provides a 3rd level of containment to prevent off-site transport of a release. So why has the oil and gas industry done such a good job of preventing spills from leaving the oil and gas site? And why have none of these spills impacted a public water system? Well, in my opinion, there's 3 main reasons. First, oil and produced water containers are located within secondary containments, sized to contain the entire volume of the largest tank, allowing for precipitation. If there is a release from that tank, it is captured by the containment. In the unlikely event that the containment were to fail, the release would be completely captured by the perimeter stormwater ditch and berm around the oil pad. Second, if a spill occurs, the facility will activate the on-site spill response team to immediately contain and clean up the spill. If the release exceeds their capability, the pre-identified 24/7 spill response contractor, per their emergency response plan, will complete the cleanup. Third is the advanced technology and training that the industry currently has. Real-time monitoring of tank storage levels, real-time monitoring of downhole well casing pressures, and real-time and remote monitoring of underground flow line pressures provide operators early warning of a possible upset. I'm referring back to the diagram that Ben showed you earlier. Moreover, DCPS operations are monitored 24/7 during the periods when spills are most likely to occur. That is, during drilling, well completion, and early production. This industry has repeatedly demonstrated that they have the expertise, skill set, technology, and manpower available on site to quickly clean up a spill before it can impact a public water supply. Currently, Great Western has approval from the City of Brighton and COGC to conduct DCPS operations within the internal buffer zone of a Brighton public water supply. The BMPs on this slide are currently listed in Rule 317B. So this is what's in effect now. Under this order, Great Western is also doing additional, or what we call enhanced BMPs for the city of Brighton. And those are these, what you see, the green enhanced BMPs. Please refer to Great Western's Exhibit 13 for the complete BMP list. In particular, I would like to note that these BMPs include increasing that secondary containment size to twice the volume of the largest tank, or 200%. Adding tertiary containment, which is a perimeter ditch and berm sized to contain the 100-year design storm event. Facility grading to ensure that on-site containment automatically that contains the release before it leaves the well pad. Automatic tank monitoring of fluid levels, real-time ambient air monitoring for combustible gases, manning facilities for 24/7 during the first 120 days of well production, providing continuous pressure monitoring of buried flow lines, and providing remote well shut-off capability. To conclude, how do these enhanced BMPs protect these 3 public water supply sources? These 4 bullets, next slide, thank you. These 4 bullets summarize how these enhanced BMPs protect public water supply sources. The oil and gas industry is required to comply with COGCC, SPCC, and Colorado stormwater regulatory protections to prevent spills. The industry prevents releases by conducting daily tank inspections, daily monitoring of fluid levels in tanks, conducting tank integrity tests, and conducting ambient air monitoring for combustible gases. They contain releases by providing containments with at least 200% capacity of the largest tank, and they employ remote well shutoff if needed. They also have early detection mechanisms for possible spills, which include ambient air monitoring for combustible gases and flow line pressure monitoring. They prevent off-site releases from impacting a public water system by using stormwater berms and lined retention, stormwater berms and ditches. And their emergency spill response plans provide the ability to mobilize spill response team and a spill response contractor if necessary. That includes my presentation. We are now open for questions.
Thank you. And I'll take your lead on whether you would like us to stop here and do questions on the public water system presentation. Mr. Oates does have a presentation on the noise rule.
Yeah, I think it's fine to go ahead and do questions on the public water system at this time. So we'll halt your time. Thank you for unsharing your screen, and I'm able to see all commissioners. And commissioners, we now have an opportunity for questions to this panel. I'd start, and I actually know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway so that we can get on the record. I appreciate Great Western's lead or involvement on this. Ms. Wazelinski, can you explain sort of the background as to why Great Western is running lead on this and how it has operations in areas that are implicated by this rule?
Sure, I'm happy to. Thank you, Chair. Great Western, as we discussed, does operate near the Brighton public water system. Great Western has a good relationship with the Brighton Public Water District and the City of Brighton, and has found success in safely and protectively operating near the Brighton public water system. When this rule was first introduced, there were certainly challenges that I think every stakeholder shared in terms of locating the proposed Goody wells. The Public Water System Group then proposed to add Type 3 wells, which presented another challenge of determining where these were, how to define them. I think we've landed at a really good place with this rule. I do appreciate the significant engagement by all stakeholders on this rule. I think really what Great Western is asking for is some clarity in the statement of basis and purpose, because we all recognize that the mapping issue was a very threshold issue. I think the the map that has been generated by staff in collaboration with other agencies is really a great tool and a great resource, and we really do appreciate it. We're simply asking that it be updated, you know, on a reasonable basis so that we can continue to know where these locations are. And then, you know, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but our waiver request is our second ask there. And I think that's a somewhat of a nuanced request, really just to facilitate further collaboration and engagement with the public water supplier. But we do feel this rule has come a long way, and we're appreciative that we were able to be involved.
Great. And if you could make sure that your PowerPoint gets over to Ms. Larson, that will be helpful to commissioners as we deliberate later on these issues. Other questions from commissioners on the Rule 411 public water supply rule? Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for sharing your testimony today. I want to make sure that I understand the second request, which I think is an alternative to asking the commission for a variance from the buffer zone would be the public water system and the operator agreeing on a location. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, that is correct. As drafted, the rule proposes that if an operator wants to conduct an operation within the 1,000-foot internal buffer, which was expanded from the 300-foot internal buffer in the original rule, that operator would have to seek a variance to the full commission. And what we're asking for is an opportunity if during notice and consultation, the operator and the public water provider can agree and say, you can locate this facility, let's say 900 feet from this type 3 well with X amount of BMPs to make sure it's protective, that we are able to present evidence of that and not have to seek a variance, recognizing that we're still going to have to file our 2A and our oil and gas development plan. It will still run through an entire staff analysis. They will have the staff can put BMPs and COAs on that permit. It will come to you as the commission to ultimately decide whether, you know, to act on the recommendation of the director. And so I think really it's just to facilitate a dialogue between entities that frankly have a large amount of expertise in this rather complex area of water law. And, you know, we found even just the locations, I think the public water supplier has a unique set of knowledge, and working with the operator, we're really just trying to collaborate together is the intent of that request.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's at the beginning of the process where you still can get input then from the relevant local government and community, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct. Our intent would be at the outset of the process. So how we see it working is after you provide notice and you do consultation with Great Western agrees to those changes, there be an opportunity to waive that the location could be within that buffer. Instead of having to add another layer of a variance, we could instead then proceed forward with filing our 2A and our oil and gas development plan and run it through the same level of review, the ALA, the notice, public comment, et cetera.
Great, thank you, that helps me, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Wazelinski, for that answer. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to follow up a little bit on Commissioner McGowan's questions there. And I'm trying to work through this in my mind so that I understand what the actual ask is. I mean, essentially what I think the ask is for the COGCC to defer the authority to a public water supplier for a variance within the inner buffer of Rule 411, which seems a little bit challenging. And the rationale behind that is to encourage engagement, whereas wouldn't that engagement occur in the variance process as well as through the 2A process? And I see the other problem with the suggestion is that a waiver could be developed under the scenario proposed, but ultimately could cause the denial of a 2A because of the location that was chosen by the waiver. Do you see that as a possibility?
I appreciate the point, Commissioner Mesner. I think from Great Western's experience, especially within the city of Brighton, nobody knows this public water system better than the public water supplier itself. There are, unique aspects of a public water system. And now that we're adding the Goody wells and the type 3 wells, and in addition, an operator knows its best management practices, to the same level. And so I think it's just marrying two levels of expertise to attempt to find a good solution to be protective. Obviously, if the public water supplier doesn't agree and says, no, we don't want that location within the buffer, there is no waiver. And if the operator wants to operate in that buffer, they're coming to the full commission. So the intent is really to, facilitate the process, not to add another layer onto the process. We recognize that as the commission, your mission and your role is to ensure that every operation is protective. If you don't agree that the agreement and the location will offer the protections, then you certainly can deny that 2A in that oil and gas development plan.
Follow up, Commissioner Messner? Okay. Other questions from the panel for the panel from commissioners? All right, seeing none. Mr. Oates, I believe you have the floor.
All right, thank you. And I believe I'm sharing. You see my slides now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. And so, great. Thank you, Chair. My name is Jason Oates. I'm the Director of External Affairs for Crestone Peak Resources. I'm going to provide testimony today in support of the staff's August draft rule on noise, Rule 423. In order to qualify my testimony, I offer my education and experience. I received a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and I've been involved with the environmental noise monitoring and responsible for working with the Commission on responding to noise-related concerns around oil and gas activity since 2012. Crestone believes that the current proposed rule should remain unchanged. That is the proposed rule. Therefore, the intent of my testimony is to provide you with a few key points to consider as you listen to other testimony on Rule 423 and evaluate various rule alternatives presented to you. As you've already seen in pre-hearing statements and written testimony, environmental noise is a very technical issue. 4 key areas the COGCC staff addressed in the draft of the rule, which are the basis for Crestone's support for the draft rule, are listed here. Distance between the noise source and receptor or measurement point, wind speed, ambient noise, and external noise sources. Crestone supports a compliance program for noise that measures noise for compliance at as close to the receptor as possible, or a receptor-based system. This approach ensures the potential impacts from development are accurately measured where the potential impacts are occurring, not at an arbitrary distance from the source as the current rule prescribes. A receptor-based noise compliance program also has the indirect benefit of incentivizing operators to site operations at a distance from the potential receptors that ensures their ability to comply with the noise rule. As the law of inverse squares proves, for each doubling of distance from the source to the receptor or measurement point, the sound level decreases by approximately 6 decibels or 300%. As the graph on this slide shows, if the receptor is moved from 350 to 1,500 feet, the corresponding noise level would decrease by approximately 13 decibels. The alignment of noise compliance point and location of receptors is a major improvement for all parties concerned with noise compliance. The distance between the source and the receptor is one variable in addressing noise impacts. Another critical specification when defining a noise monitoring process is wind speed. Environmental noise measurement is conducted with microphones, which are very sensitive to wind. Wind screens are prescribed by the rules to limit erroneous data, but wind screens are not perfect. Therefore, limiting the collection of data to times when wind is less than 5 miles per hour is also critical to accurately measuring a noise source in an outdoor environment, especially in relation to low frequency noise or noise measured on the C-weighted scale. The graphs on the right show C-scale noise and wind collected simultaneously for an operation Crestone was conducting last week near a drilling rig. Based on the graphs, these appear to be, there appears to be a relationship between noise measurement and wind speed. When you overlay the two, the relationship becomes even more pronounced. When the wind speed increases, the noise level measured also increases, and vice versa. Using the same data presented on the previous slide, I plotted wind speed versus DBC noise level, and then conducted a regression analysis. Analyzing the best fit line, the coefficient of determination, or the R-squared value, indicates relatively strong relationship between wind speed and low frequency noise. Further refining the specification of wind speed to between 0 and 5 miles per hour, the relationship between wind speed and low frequency noise is very weak or almost non-existent, as you can tell by the flat line. Focusing on wind speed greater than 5 miles per hour, the relationship returns to an extent that over 60% of the variation in low frequency noise is explained by wind speed for the data in this sample population. These graphs further demonstrate the sensitivity of wind speed on low frequency noise and why 5 miles per hour is the supported limit in the rule. One scenario that further complicates noise compliance programs is how to address situations where the environment an oil and gas project is being proposed already exceeds the standard for the land use designation. In these instances, the sound level of the existing area or ambient environment needs to be established, and a threshold above this ambient level needs to be there needs to be a site-specific standard. In the example on this slide, if an oil and gas project has a 60 decibel profile and is added to an environment with a 60 decibel ambient profile, then the expected sound level is expected to rise by 3 decibels or 63 decibels. Setting the limit at the expected value of 63 does not factor in other sources potentially occurring in the same environment during the proposed oil and gas development. If the ambient sound level is 60 at the proposed commercial zone limit, the oil and gas project is 60, and another source also complies with the zoned area at 60, the resulting cumulative sound level would be 64.8 or 4.8 decibels greater than the ambient. The proposed rule sets the site-specific standard of 7 decibels above ambient during day and 5 decibels above ambient at night. As demonstrated, these increases are not arbitrary and ensures that sound level limit is a balance with reasonable expectations of compliance. Finally, oil and gas operations strive to minimize impacts to the greatest extent possible. One aspect of the noise compliance process that is not straightforward or readily apparent when reviewing noise data is the impact of external sources on the collected data. These outliers are very impactful on the data collection and require extensive time and resources to investigate and explain. The data process of averaging minute by minute data helps to average some of these spikes out of the data, but it does not completely explain what is occurring on site. As you can see from the graph, data collection systems exist that record the noise that cause samples to be flagged as exceedances. It would not be inaccurate to say that the greatest value recorded during the noise study in the graph below was 87 decibels. And without the sound recording to prove it was a meadowlark singing near one of the noise monitors, this value would be pursued as an exceedance of the standard. Other examples of external or non-normal events influencing noise monitoring are displayed on this slide. In closing, the 4 key points the COGCC staff addressed in the draft of Rule 423 that Crestone bases its support for the rule are again listed here. These 4 key points are also good rules of thumb to keep in mind when reviewing noise data and also questions to ask when evaluating noise studies presented to you. I conclude my presentation. What questions can I answer for you?
Thank you, Mr. Oates. If you want to stop sharing, I'll be able to see everybody a little bit better.
Where'd that go?
I like that little springy trash can looking thing.
Where'd it go? I see you. Hold on a second. There it is. Okay, I have multiple screens.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oates. This time we have questions from commissioners to Mr. Oates on his noise presentation. Mr. Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Oates, for that presentation. I found it very informative, and I appreciate it. And I just want to point out that while it may not quite be as good from a graphic standpoint as Mr. Andrews' presentation, it was pretty darn close. So I give you a lot of credit for that.
Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner McGowan?
I was just going to congratulate Mr. Oates on stretching my statistics and regression modeling abilities. It was very informative, though. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Oates, we thank you for your presentation. Ms. Wazelinski, does this conclude the presentation from your panel?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, one last time, any other questions, folks? Seeing none, we will zoom away this panel. On our schedule, we have a break set for now. I would suggest we were about 20 minutes early, but let's go ahead and do the afternoon break, and then Ms. Larson can get the Adams County panel, which is up next. It is 2:41. Let's return at 2:51. Commissioners, welcome back, Colorado, to the last session of day 7 of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's rulemaking. We have several additional parties to hear from this afternoon. Ms. Larson, is it correct that Adams County is presenting next?
That is correct.
Do we have Mr. Dean or maybe Attorney Finch?
And yes, we will in just one moment.
Finch, sorry. Good afternoon, Adams County folks. Good to see you both with us again. Thank you again for your participation in this process. The agenda has you down for 6 minutes, and you can get started. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right, good afternoon, commissioners. I'm going to share my screen. I apologize, my Zoom has been repeatedly crashing today, so I'm just going to apologize in advance if that happens. And hopefully you all can see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Awesome. So good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Christy Fitch. I am an assistant county attorney for Adams County, and with me virtually is Gregory Dean, our oil and gas liaison. The county would request that we save an additional 1 minute for our closing statement on this matter. Adams County supports the efforts of the COGCC to consider additions and amendments to the Commission's Rules of Practice and Procedure as directed by Senate Bill 19181. The county wants to ensure that these changes to the Commission's rules accurately protect the public health, safety, welfare, and the environment and wildlife resources. Specific to the 400 series rules, Adams County will be focusing on noise. Adams County had 60% of the complaints received in the last year from Adams County are noise complaints, and we do often see that those come from residential neighborhoods. Gregory Dean will be taking it from here with our specifics.
Thank you, Ms. Fitch. I'm Gregory Dean, the Oil and Gas Liaison and Local Government Designee for Adams County. I'll be speaking to some of the county's more specific comments on the 400 series, particularly as it pertains to proposed Rule 423 noise. First, the county requests added specificity in 423B surrounding the requirement of background ambient noise surveys. Specifically, we are requesting a requirement in the rule that operators must submit such a noise survey to the director for all proposed locations within 2,000 feet of building units, rather than only at the director's request as currently presented. Additionally, this rule should further include a provision that when a background noise survey is required, that survey should be further updated by the operator if subsequent pre-production operations at the location occur more than 12 months after the initial occupation. These requests will help address cumulative noise impacts from future offsetting operations and account for any changes in surrounding development between trips to the pad. Next slide, please. Second, the county submitted a recent.
Greg?
Yes?
Hold on just a sec. I don't think we switched slides. Oh, no, maybe we did.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Second, the county submitted a recent noise study as Exhibit 2 to our 400 series pre-hearing statement that addresses low frequency or DBC noise impacts on public health. In line with the results of that peer-reviewed study, and that is supported by Battlement Concerned Citizens, Conservation Colorado, and other parties, for which will be further testifying on this matter in future presentations, including by the author of said study. The county believes the study is applicable for the evaluation of appropriate regulatory noise levels, and contrary to Industry Group 1's testimony, much of the community noises measured in this study that they alluded to were related to heavy truck traffic that was associated with equipment moving on and off location of oil and gas. As such, the county argues that it seems logical that as proposed maximum permissible A-scale noise are lower in residential zoned areas, then so too should C-scale noise levels for those same areas. From the table of proposed Rule 423B1 below on my slide, the county is specifically requesting a reduction in proposed allowable C-scale noise in only the residential land use designation areas to 60 dBc during daytime and 55 dBc during nighttime operations, and supports the remainder of the maximum permissible noise level proposal by staff. Next slide, please. Third, and related to our request for lower maximum permissible low frequency noise in residential areas, we are requesting a new provision in proposed Rule 423B that operators be required to comply with the more protective maximum noise levels when the working pad surface is located within 2,000 feet of a land use designation boundary as determined by the relevant local government. The map on the right depicts the importance of this request. This is an approved pad in Adams County as an example that is sited in an agricultural zone district, but is only 675 feet away from a residential zone district and dense residential development. Under current proposed rules, this site would only be required to comply with the agricultural noise standards and not the residential ones. This pseudo setback or buffer zone will further reduce offsite noise impacts, accounts for non-conforming land uses, and gives protection to those residents living in or near areas that are otherwise not zoned residential. Next slide. Next, the county appreciates the incorporation of our requests and supports the current proposal by staff in Rule 423B3 that land use designations for the determination of maximum permissible noise under 423B1 be explicitly determined by the relevant local government. This proposal ensures the allowable noise levels are determined by land use designation rather than simply land use, and as is in the Commission's current noise rules. Next slide. And lastly, the county requests the indicated issues language in Rule 423C2 as it pertains to the measurement of low frequency DBC noise in response to a complaint be removed. More specifically, we are requesting that DBC noise should explicitly be measured by an operator or COGCC inspectors in response to all complaints that meet the requirements of 423B8. This request removes the onus on the public or local governments to be able to specifically delineate between A and C scale related issues within the content of their complaints that are filed with the Commission. This concludes Adams County's testimony on the 400 series, and I am available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Ms. Fitch. Ms. Fitch, if you could email the slides over to Ms. Larson, that would be helpful for us. We appreciate that.
I will do that.
A lot of information there, so it's easier to get it from slides than trying to look at my notes. Do we have questions for Mr. Dean? I guess I'll start out. Mr. Dean, you heard industry sort of have a specific take against the exhibit that you've developed and that you were relying on. Do you want to, and you were quickly going through that, do you want to add anything else to your rebut to industry's take on your exhibit?
Yes, and I'll defer to Christy Fitch if she wants to add anything else. While we acknowledge that this noise study may have not been perfect, we do feel that it is appropriate because a lot of the off-site traffic impacts that they were citing as the reason to not use this study were actually the study determined them community noises, and they related them to heavy truck traffic associated with oil and gas operations. So they were saying that the traffic affected the study's results, but a lot of the traffic noise that they were measuring appears to have occurred in relation to oil and gas operations at the site that they were monitoring in the first place. Battlement Concerned Citizens plans to have the author of this study testify tomorrow, so that author should be able to address any more specific study-related questions.
Great deference to the author of the study himself. Thank you very much. That's great, and we'll look forward to getting that testimony. I think it's set for tomorrow morning. Other questions for this panel from commissioners? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the testimony. I wonder if you could put the PowerPoint presentation back up, because there was a couple of slides in there, and I'm trying to figure out the relationship between your support of 423B3, which does determine a basis for determining land use designation pursuant to Rule 423B1, and it will be the relevant local government's land use or zoning designation would determine that. And I wonder how that, this is a slide, how that interacts with this slide and your concern about this situation.
Mr. Dean.
Yes, thank you for that question, Commissioner Messner. Christy Fitch is our Assistant County Attorney, and she is more qualified to address land use versus land use designation differences. So I'll defer to Ms. Fitch first, and then I can address this slide specifically after that.
Yeah, so I think the county specifically wanted to support what staff had added into the rules as far as deferring to the local land use designation. In multiple land use cases, we see legal nonconforming uses as well as certain industrial uses being permitted on these agricultural properties that really don't fit the underlying land use without these additional protections, which our oil and gas facility permit as well as the COGCC permit process is looking to defray those additional impacts. So the county is just requesting that this language is specific to land use designation as determined by the local government stay in the rules, because a lot of the times, especially in the county, our oil and gas facilities are actually located in agricultural zone districts. So we would want those to be required to be under the agricultural noise standards in that situation because they are in that district and in that land use designation.
And this goes to some specific instances we've had in the county with noise complaints filed by residents in nearby residential areas. And when COGC has required an operator to conduct a background or a noise study in response to that complaint, their contention was that because the use on the property was industrial, that they were required to only follow industrial noise standards and not the standards of the zonation or land use designation where the pad is actually located. One instance, we had one, it was cited in agricultural, so we would expect that they would have to follow agricultural noise standards, but they were contending in response to a complaint that they had to follow industrial noise standards because their use on the surface was industrial. So that's kind of the difference between land use designation and land use.
I wonder if just help me through this as well. I mean, my brain is a little muddled this afternoon, so I apologize. But the relevant local government could certainly change the land designation should they choose to, or the zoning of the particular area, understanding the challenges behind legal non-conforming uses. And I fully understand that. But what I hear you saying is that you would like to, in a lot of these instances, keep the land designation as agriculture and not change the zoning. Is that what I'm hearing, or help me understand what I'm hearing here?
Correct. Yeah. So in our county's process, and I think a lot of similar processes for oil and gas locations, since they are so unique, do actually keep the underlying zoning, and the oil and gas facility permit is more akin to like a conditional use permit. So they are being placed in these, at least in Adams County, we have seen these being placed in more typical residential areas. So we would like to defer, and we do defer to the underlying zoning as far as additional standards that we do add.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other commissioners with questions, and just pipe up as I can't see you all. Oh, now I can. Thanks. Your Zoom's working great. All right, I'm not seeing other commissioners with questions. Thank you for your presentation and for your continued commitment to working with us on these important issues. Thank you again, and we will hear from you, I'm sure, later on the 600 series. So we will let you be zoomed away, and then we will bring in the next panel, which is the Affiliated Local Government Coalition, including the City of Aurora and the City of Thornton.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Elizabeth Pranos here on behalf of the Affiliated Local Government Coalition and the City of Aurora. We have 3 witnesses today who will speak to Rules 411, 423, and 424. Prior to their testimony, I wish to express the ALGC and City of Aurora's support for the new provision in Rule 304 that allows operators to submit, quote, substantially equivalent information or plans developed through a local government siting process, unquote, to meet their Form 2A requirements. We believe this addresses concerns raised by some parties that commission plan requirements may be duplicative of local requirements, as well as concerns that commission rules may conflict with local requirements. Rule 304 requires the commission and staff to review substantially equivalent information and determine that such information is, in fact, substantially equivalent in terms of protections afforded. This allows for a comparison of, for example, different BMPs to minimize noise, taking into consideration the specific type of operation proposed. We believe staff and the commission have the expertise to compare different BMPs or other conditions of approval and make an informed determination as to whether locally required provisions are substantially equivalent to commission requirements, and thus will adequately protect public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife. And with that, I'll turn it over to our first witness, Joshua Goodwin, who will provide testimony on Rule 411.
Mr. Goodwin.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Great. So my name is Joshua Godwin, actually. Good afternoon, commissioners. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the City of Aurora. The ALGC also supports my testimony. I am a geohydrologist for Aurora Water for the City of Aurora. I have 9 years of experience working as a groundwater modeler, engineer, and geohydrologist. I have worked on Superfund sites, groundwater contamination and cleanup, groundwater forensics, regulatory development, and litigation, as well as legislation. The City of Aurora, as well as the ALGC, recommends COGCC prohibit the use of 23 chemicals of concern statewide, not just solely in the internal and intermediate buffer zones of a surface water supply area. This is because, as staff presented earlier, these chemicals are highly toxic and include benzene, a known human carcinogen. Many local governments, including Aurora, Adams County, and members of the ALGC, already prohibit or plan to prohibit the use of chemicals of concern through their jurisdictions. Notably, the release of chemicals such as benzene, lead, mercury, arsenic, and others can threaten human health, the environment, and wildlife, even if it occurs further than 2,640 feet from a classified water supply segment, and thus outside of any buffer zones intended to protect water public supply systems. Releases or spills can occur due to improper storage, handling, or during transportation of these chemicals. Thus, a spill of benzene could result from an incident involving the transport of benzene through absolutely no fault of the driver or the operators. No BMPs, absolutely no BMPs can completely prevent release due to traffic accidents. This could occur anywhere in the state, not just in the intermediate buffer zone. While we believe the COGCC should prohibit the use of these chemicals anywhere in the state, at a minimum, we recommend prohibiting chemicals of concern in the external as well as the internal and intermediate buffer zones. A spill or release that occurs between the intermediate and external buffer zones up gradient of a classified water supply segment would likely impact such a water supply segment because of the likelihood that the release occurs within a capture zone. Now, a capture zone is the complete area from which a well draws its water. And the incident could easily be exacerbated by heavier rains, topography of an area, or delayed emergency response for, times for spills in more remote areas. In order to adequately protect drinking water, chemicals of concern, including known carcinogens such as benzene, must be prohibited statewide, but at a minimum, anywhere within an external buffer zone. Also, the COGCC should include ephemeral streams in the definition of a classified water supply segment. While ephemeral streams are only live and flowing during heavier rain events, water in the subsurface still exists and can still act as a conduit for a contaminant release. A conduit that could also be a critical part of a water supplier's operations, like the Box Elder Creek is for Aurora. Box Elder Creek is an ephemeral stream where Aurora is actively developing an aquifer storage and recovery program. A release into the Box Elder Creek would be the equivalent of an oil spill into Dillon or Cheeseman Reservoir. Hopefully you can see this is not just a request to protect ephemeral streams. This is a request to protect storage sites, sites deemed critical in the Colorado Water Plan. I should also mention that the CDPG does not distinguish between perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral. They look at a stream segment's potential for water supply. And yes, the CDPG does track these segments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Godwin. Ms. Paranos, who do you have next?
We have Jonathan Ferdinand next, who will speak to Rule 423. Hopefully.
Yep, I'm here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Elizabeth said, my name is Jonathan Ferdinand. I worked for Vibrotech Engineers for the past 15 years as a noise and vibration consultant, mainly working in the mining, quarry, construction, and energy industries. My background is bachelor's and master's degree in environmental science. I'm also currently engaged with Broomfield and Boulder counties with regard to noise monitoring and consulting services relative to the work that's currently going on in both those counties. Today, I'd like to discuss two rule changes that relate to the following issues. The first is information that operators should provide in their overall noise mitigation plan. And the second is the maximum allowable dBA and dBc noise limits. So to begin, the information provided as part of the noise mitigation plan should be robust, detailed, and comprehensive. As noted by staff in the proposed statement of basis, the information provided in the noise mitigation plan must be sufficient to allow the operator to work with commission staff through the Form 2A process to ensure that the plan for noise mitigation at a particular site is adequate and will enable the operator to comply with the substantive noise requirements in Rule 423. Having said that, we suggest two improvements to the rule are necessary to meet this goal. The first is we believe that in Rule 423A1 that the operator must update their noise mitigation plan anytime a piece of equipment is changed or replaced. This is because different pieces and types of equipment and sizes of equipment can emit significantly different levels of noise. The noise mitigation plan should reflect the actual equipment and subsequent noise level produced at the site, not just the anticipated levels regardless of the equipment size or type. So it should be equipment specific. The second suggested improvement in Rule 423A2 would be to make the operator provide detailed information regarding the methods, procedures, noise reference information, and results underlying the operator's estimates of expected noise levels. If the detail and granular information is not provided, then staff won't have the ability to ensure that the operator's estimated noise levels and the predictions of that noise are accurate. With respect to the maximum permissible noise levels allowed under Rule 423, we have a number of suggestions to ensure noise levels from the well pads do not cause sleep or other disturbances to nearby residents, and especially at night. First, we suggest a deletion of Rule 423B2, which allows the operator to exceed the maximum permissible noise levels that apply to residential, rural, and commercial agriculture zoned areas during the pre-production activities. And the reason for this exemption, as per the proposed statement of basis, is that pre-production activities are short in duration. But we believe this isn't entirely true, and in some cases, multi-well facilities have pre-production activities that go on for months and even years. Allowing increased noise levels during pre-production time periods in residential areas could result in impermissible and unacceptable noise levels for nearby residents. We also object to and have suggested deletion of the exemption in 423B6 that allows operators to increase noise level by 10 dB for a 15-minute period in any given hour. An increase of 10 dB or 10 dBA is substantial and represents essentially a doubling of the noise level. This amount of increase is unacceptable, especially for residents living, working, and recreating in the nearby neighborhoods. Rule 423D allows operators to increase noise levels above existing ambient by certain increments when the existing ambient noise in the area already exceeds the maximum permissible noise levels within Rule 423. We do understand the need to allow for some flexibility in allowable increases above existing ambient in such cases. However, we suggest the operators be limited to an allowable increase of 4 dB above ambient. Any increase beyond 4 dB is likely to be perceived as highly perceptible to disturbing to nearby residents, and again, especially at night. Finally, in no instances should the rule allow for an increase in dBc levels above the maximum permissible level of 65 dBc, regardless of day or night. dBc noise levels are greater than 65 are likely to cause annoyance, and in some cases, based on the amplitude of that noise, can result in window rattle, airborne vibration, and again, complaints by residents. That's all I have for you today. I'll take any questions.
Go ahead, Ms. Parnos.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next, we have Kelly Smith from the City of Fort Collins to speak to the lighting rule.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Would you mind pausing the time so that I can share my screen?
Yep. You are paused.
Fantastic. Thank you. Everyone see that okay?
We can.
My name is Kelly Smith, and I'm a senior environmental planner and licensed landscape architect at the City of Fort Collins. In my current role, I am responsible for reviewing development applications to ensure compliance with city standards, and this includes reviewing lighting plans. I'm also responsible for developing regulations related to natural resource protection. One project I've been managing for the past 1.5 years is the overhaul of the city's exterior lighting standards. This project is changing the city's regulatory approach from applying lighting minimums and maximums for activity areas, such as parking lots and sidewalks, to requiring lighting budgets based on a site's context and hardscape square footage, a similar concept being proposed by the COGCC. I'm happy to discuss my experience with this project in greater detail if you wish. The ALGC commends COGCC for including lighting standards in the rulemaking process. Lighting is a tool that protects worker safety, yet can be detrimental to public health, safety, welfare, and the environment. While the COGCC has made incredible strides to address light pollution, the ALGC feels some standards could go a step further. First, the ALGC strongly recommends that the lumen budget table be modified to include a more protective allowance reserved for sensitive habitat areas. The lumen budget is taken almost verbatim from the model lighting ordinance, which was jointly developed by the International Dark Sky Association and the Illuminating Engineering Society. However, the table was modified and residential and conserved lands were lumped into one category. This effectively eliminated the most protective lumen budget reserved for sensitive habitat areas, and it does not clarify that the highest zone should be used very sparingly. Second, create a metric by which light cannot trespass beyond an oil and gas facility boundary, which would be demonstrated in the photometric plan. This would help mitigate light trespass issues on adjacent properties while creating an enforceable regulation. Third, the ALGC encourages the COGCC to consider budgets for backlight, uplight, and glare, which are also included in the model lighting ordinance. This would help control all aspects of light pollution. Fourth, the ALGC does not believe the cumulative impact provision is enforceable. Light meters can accurately measure lux in the immediate vicinity of a light source, but not up to 1 mile away. The ALGC recommends the COGCC develop a new approach that is measurable and enforceable. And finally, the ALGC recommends that the COGCC develop a task force comprised of technical and industry experts and local jurisdictions to evaluate the efficacy of state lighting regulations across jurisdictional boundaries and make recommendations that strengthen standards to ensure adequate lighting for worker safety while protecting public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. This concludes testimony from the ALGC. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Thank you for on-screen sharing. And that concludes your witness panel?
Correct.
Okay, good. So now we have the opportunity for commissioner questions to this panel. I've got a question for the gentleman from the city of Aurora. Having worked with the city, I know that water is precious and the city does a lot in terms of its water. There you go, Mr. Godwin. So I had two questions. One, the ephemeral stream piece. Can you go into a little more detail about that, about how it is that an ephemeral stream can still serve as a conduit to problems underground, even if it's not like at a spot where it's actually running? You'll need to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. You didn't hear me just babble for like 3 seconds. That's great. So ephemeral streams are streams that are flowing during certain rain events. But when we say flowing, we can see them at the surface. But when the water subsides, the stream isn't quote unquote still quote unquote live, but instead there is still subsurface flow. For instance, like I've mentioned, Box Elder Creek is an ephemeral stream, and it moves through northeast Aurora. It isn't live. I don't think I've been here about 4 years. I've never seen it actually live. However, there is groundwater beneath it, and that groundwater has a gradient, and if it has a gradient, it has movement. So despite it not being a live and flowing stream, it is still a conduit for anything that is beneath the surface. So if you have a spill up gradient into the stream and it migrates to where the stream bed is, any groundwater will still migrate that contaminant downstream, or downstream in our mind, which way it would be flowing if it were live. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. That sheds more light on the topic, so appreciate that. I had one other question for you, and this may not be fair and it may be outside your wheelbox, but we heard from certain operators from the West Slope that this has to do with the chemicals, that certain of the chemicals listed are naturally occurring, and there is a environmental positive to reduce and reuse water, which would contain some of those naturally occurring chemicals. Do you have information about that, or do you want to speak to that? Or I know you're Aurora based, and so you may not have information on that.
Yeah, you caught me a little flat-footed there. I guess what I will say is maybe we're mostly concerned about adding any additional chemicals, whereas we recognize there's the naturally occurring chemicals. And in these instances, I think it's completely up for discussion on the nature and amount. But yeah, like you mentioned, I'm certainly not a chemical expert.
Okay, well, that sheds a little light on that topic as well.
Okay.
Other commissioners with questions for this panel? Okay, I see two hands jump up. I saw Ms. McGowan first, so we'll start there and then we'll get to Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for your testimony today. For the gentleman who was talking about noise and the 15 minutes at the, I think it's the 10 decibels, being too much, I'm wondering if you have an alternative suggestion. I'm just thinking of, different kinds of construction activities that happen as a normal part of life, like your street being repaired or an apartment complex being built. The noise probably exceeds whatever is zoned or the limits that have been set on an occasional basis just because of the nature of the activity. And so I don't think I heard you offer an alternative proposal, or if you did, I missed it.
Mr. Ferdinand.
Yes, so I didn't offer an alternative. I think what our stance is that the 10 dB increase, especially at night, would be considered unacceptable. During the day and during times when construction is happening, maybe it's not as perceivable. But obviously during the nighttime hours when things settle down, then that 10 dB becomes a much bigger number and a much bigger problem.
Commissioner McGowan, follow up.
Sorry, I need to go back and look at the rules, but I thought some of the activities were limited to between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. to reduce nighttime noise, but maybe that doesn't apply in this section that you referenced. Sorry, and I'm trying to find it. So if someone could clarify for me.
Does staff want to weigh in on this if you're listening?
Mr. Chair. I believe it's 423A part, I just had it and then I lost it. Sorry, 423B part 6. I believe that's the same point that you were referencing. I see that AAG Minor is on, so I'll turn it over to him as the expert.
If I may, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Nanchapa is correct. I believe the relevant provision would be 423B6. And I believe we have Mr. Leonard now, who is the true expert in this.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard.
Thank you, Chair. So it's important to note that that is already in current rule. And I believe that was placed in current rule many, many years ago when there was a lot of air drilling for coal bed methane and in other parts of the state. And it's really designed to be a very short duration for when they're like they were tripping pipe out of the hole. There'd be air pressure in the drill stem, and they'd break it apart, and you'd have this shrill whistle. Other times it may occur is starting of compressors and things like that, where you have to bypass some air or gas to initiate that engine starting. I think we did modify it though. The AG minor, we modified it that it can't happen 15 minutes every hour, right?
You're limited to 1 hour for any 12-hour period. And if I'm reading it correctly, it can only happen between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Am I not reading that right?
So.
Unless otherwise required.
That is correct, if I may, Mr. Chair, that is correct, Commissioner McGowan. So that this is only allowed during the daytime. And Mr. Leonard is correct that the final sentence in 423B6 was added in, I believe, the August 17th staff draft. It is not in current rule 80, I believe it's 802, where noise rules are located, 803, sorry. So that was added to just clarify that this can't happen every hour. It does need to be sort of a once a day occurrence.
Thank you.
Any further follow-up, Commissioner McGowan? Oh, I see you turned off, so no. Okay. Commissioner Messner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I wonder if Commissioner Putnam would provide a little information. I think it was indicated that by Mr. Godwin that CDPHE has a definition for ephemeral streams, and I wonder how that definition, or if there was some tie-in between what's being contemplated here and how CDPHE approaches it.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner, and may need to see if I can pull some of our source water protection experts, but I can give you preliminary answers that yes, for waters of the state, we include ephemeral and permanent waters in our definition of protection. I believe there's a distinction for our source water protection, however, and I'll get you that information and we'll be able to report on that before deliberations.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Appreciate that. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you. And thank you for that, Commissioner Putnam. I'd appreciate that. So I'll shift now to, well, let me stay on the chemical piece and
Chair and Commissioner.
Yeah, Director Murphy.
Before we jump, I'm sorry, on that last question, Commissioner Messner, we've continued to have conversations with CDPHE about some clarifications to our language around ephemeral, intermittent, et cetera. And so I kind of assumed we would get some direction from the commissioners to work on 411 a little bit more, and we would bring back the recommendations from CDPHE as part of that work, but wanted to acknowledge that midday today, late today, or in the last few hours, I got a little more feedback from CDPHE on it.
So we'll be able to have staff address that in closing or after we've heard from all parties?
Yep.
Great.
Thanks. Sorry to interrupt, Commissioner. I just didn't want to lose track of that conversation.
Nope, that was a worthy interruption. Commissioner Messner, back to you to take us to a different place.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm acknowledging now that I missed my opportunity to ask this question to the previous industry group as well. And so I may have to re-ask that question at some point here. But, you know, I do acknowledge, and I think it's been indicated by staff that there is the impact of being able to reutilize water with the ban on chemicals, and I understand that. I guess my question is, and perhaps Mr. Godwin, you know the answer to this, but perhaps not, and I'll find another way to perhaps answer my question, but is it reasonable to think that at least for a time that those chemicals on that chemicals of concern list could be removed from water in a treatment process in order to be able to potentially reuse that water in oil and gas operations?
Well, one, I'll preface all of this with I am not a treatment expert. And the answer is yes, they could treat this water. It's just a question for the industry of at what cost.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to shift now to lighting and so I think it was indicated, well, first of all, let me ask Ms. Smith, you indicated that if asked, you would be willing to provide additional information on your lighting regulations. And so I certainly want to give you the opportunity to do that, because it seems to me that you've just gone through a pretty significant process to figure out how to evaluate lighting in a lot of different land use situations. So if there was something that you wanted to make sure that we knew that you didn't have the time to bring up, I'd like to ask that question now.
Ms. Smith.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. We have gone through extensive stakeholder engagement on this project, which is why it's taken so long to adopt. It's hard to sort of develop regulations and place it on the ground and understand their performance. And so it was critical to provide that sort of information and experience to a lot of our stakeholders. So we did a lot of tours on different development sites and evaluated those the lighting plans. And so I'll say that, and which is a huge reason as to why I think a task force would be helpful post-mortem of this rulemaking, so that we, if there are any issues, we can have at least a way to update those standards, because we're already, the city of Fort Collins is already anticipating something like that happening with this rule, with our standards. I think the other thing that I want to just highlight is the biggest nuisance complaint that the city gets is related to glare, not really necessarily light trespass per se. And so I think having some type of provision in your standards that really is a measurable and enforceable standard related to glare would be really helpful. And so really what the city is doing now is taking on this model lighting ordinance, right? And so we are including backlight, uplight, and glare budgets as well as lumens. And so I totally can relate to what you guys are proposing, and I really appreciate it. I just feel like it could go a little bit further.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Follow-up, Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that elaboration on that. And I think the concept of a task force to further evaluate this makes some sense to me. So I think this is a question to staff. So I think Ms. Smith indicated that some of our language was based on the model lighting ordinance, but it was modified. And I guess I'm curious as to what were some of the rationales behind the modifications?
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Minor.
I actually think
I was
that
waiting
perhaps,
to see who was going to go.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to maybe turn it over to Mr. Leonard, and but before I do, say that staff relied on a variety of sources for developing the proposed lighting rules. Mr. Leonard and others on his team really reviewed quite a few standards from different local governments around the state, and sometimes even in other states, looked at various models, and in many cases sort of combined some of the best practices that found in many different places. So Mr. Leonard, I don't know if you want to give a couple specific examples of how you took regulations from other places and made sure that they made sense in the COGCC context.
Thank you, Mr. Minor. We did look at regulations, other regulations from across the state. I believe Arapahoe County. We looked at some regulations from Fort someplace, Texas, and I can't remember the Fort whatever it was in Texas. They're really all over the problem with the lighting regulations is they are kind of all over the board, and they talk to residential, commercial, parking lots, things like that. And we're in the situation here of worker safety as well, not just protecting the public. And I don't know if Mr. Andrews is on. He was part of that investigation as well. We did work with other stakeholders trying to come to a good place. I'm interested in hearing what Fort Collins has. They have some very, very interesting ideas there.
Maybe what we can do is introduce you to Ms. Smith, and you guys can talk offline. And if there's any additional perspective you could bring back when we speak with staff again, that would be great.
Sure, we can do that.
Commissioners, other questions for this panel? Commissioner Nanjapa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a little bit of a follow-up from some of the testimony from industry with respect to wanting to, in some instances, for example, with noise, having the ability to provide their plan for mitigation closer to the production, the actual production timeframe. Whereas for some of the other nuisance issues like lighting, there was some concern about having to provide it in advance when things may change. I was just curious from your perspective if the changes are an issue, or sort of knowing what to expect is more of an issue, or is just the overall sort of minimization and mitigation what you're looking for, or is there something else there? And has this caused a problem in the past?
Is this being directed towards lighting or with noise as well?
In general, with these various nuisance issues in 420 that are covered under 423?
So hopefully I can answer your question related to lighting anyway. And I think that, I listened to the industry's testimony on lighting and their concern about sort of the pre-production phase lighting and the mitigation plan requirements. And, I think there is, I would agree that what they are saying might be overboard what is in the current standard in terms of orientation and location of lighting. A potential solution would be a narrative showing how they are meeting those standards, sort of those mitigation standards, and then come up with a more detailed plan later on. We do that a lot in terms of sort of the different phases of development review is require additional information at every stage of the way. So I think that could certainly be a solution here. Did I address your concern, or do you have another question, Bill?
Thank you, Ms. Smith. I wanted to just hear from others as well if that was a concern. It was, raised more as as something that kind of creates difficulty or potentially extra work. And I was just curious from your perspective if those issues are more important to have a good plan and mitigation up front, or is it more important to know the details as you get closer to production, knowing that things may change?
And I would agree. I would say that it's more important to get the details as you become closer and closer to that final development stage. The standards that are being presented right now in the rule are pretty strong. And so if they adhere to those standards and can say through narrative that they can achieve those standards by, let's say directing the light downward and not upward, and having some type of shielding if practical, then I think that's totally legitimate. I wouldn't, that's how we sort of operate in the city anyway, is requiring additional information.
And Commissioner Nanjapa, if I can elaborate a little bit more as well. We do believe one of the reasons why the ALGC asked that 423A1 be revised to require the operators to update their noise mitigation plan anytime that a piece of equipment is changed or replaced is because we are very aware that, as the operator gets closer to actually constructing and even goes forward post-constructing into operations, they may indeed change pieces of equipment at the facility, and that those changes can have a significant impact on noise, for example, as well as other impacts. And so I think it is important that the plan is a living document, not something that's just provided once and is never modified to reflect what's actually ongoing at the pad site.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Nanjapa, do you have follow-up on this topic?
No, thank you very much.
Other commissioners with questions for this panel? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, thank you very much, panel, for this presentation. The information has been very helpful for us. If we could get your PowerPoints as is sort of the standing order, we would appreciate it. Emailed to Ms. Larson, that'll help us. And we will allow this panel to be zoomed away. And I believe we are bringing in Western Resource Advocates for a 4-minute presentation next. I see Ms. Walker is already there. Ms. Larson is on top of it. Excellent. Ms. Walker, do you have others that are joining you?
I do not.
Well, then take it away. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks. Sharing my screen.
Okay, we'll start timing after you get the screen all up and running.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Jorah Walker with Western Resource Advocates, and today we comment on Rule 411A, which is the part of the rule that focuses on surface water. In its simplest form, 411A intends to protect drinking water by putting buffers around surface waters 5 miles upstream from drinking water intakes. We propose that the basis for Rule 411A itself shows that the rule must be expanded to meet the purpose of the rule, to protect one of Colorado's most important resources, drinking water. Here on this slide are the definitions of that Rule 411A.
Ms. Walker, let me stop you and maybe get you to start over. I at least do not see your screen.
Oh dear, sorry. That's because I forgot to. I apologize.
Ms. Larson, if we could rewind the clock, we'll just allow her to start over so that we can follow along with her screen.
Certainly.
Once we get it up and running.
I don't see what I'm doing wrong.
Oh.
Better?
Better, yes.
I'm sorry about that.
Even better still. Okay, we'd like you to maybe start from the beginning.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that. So we comment today on Rule 411A, which is part of the rule that focuses on surface water. And in its simplest form, intends to protect drinking water by putting buffers around surface waters 5 miles upstream from a drinking water intake. We propose that the basis for Rule 411 itself shows the rule must be expanded to meet the purpose of the rule, to protect one of Colorado's most important resources, its drinking water. Here are the definitions that 411A relies on to protect drinking water and that we suggest need to be amended to fulfill the purpose of the rule. Currently, as written, Rule 411A is based on the understanding that oil and gas operations threaten water quality, including the quality of drinking water. And this is why the current rule puts buffers around the applicable surface waters. Second, the rule recognizes that buffers are necessary to protect surface water quality, including an internal buffer that closes an area within 1,000 feet of a segment to all oil and gas development. However, the proposed purpose and basis of Rule 411A shows that the rule does not protect future drinking water supplies from OGDP approvals made now. The expert agency in this case, WQCCC, has classified stream segments in Colorado as water supply segments precisely because they are suitable for drinking water supplies now and in the future. This means that these segments are the future sources of drinking water for Coloradans, which is a critical concern as the state's population expands and as climate change puts added pressure on Colorado's water supply. You have heard and read testimony that oil and gas operations at a particular site can last a long time, for decades. This means that a project approved now will impact segments that may become drinking water sources in the future. So the same reasoning that requires protection of existing drinking water sources requires protection of future water drinking sources, as defined by WQCCC. However, Rule 411A does not protect all water supply segments, but only a small subset of these segments. Second, as written, Rule 411A does not protect drinking water supplies from upstream activities. We have submitted testimony that shows beyond a doubt that what happens upstream impacts water quality downstream. Most recently, the state of Colorado has argued exactly this at length to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. Colorado stated to the court that the Clean Water Act protections must be extended way up into the watershed and into the state's headwaters in order to protect water quality, including the quality of drinking water, a considerable way downstream. We make proposals that carry out the current purpose and basis of Rule 411A. First, we specify that the rule should protect existing and future drinking water supplies as defined by WQCC by using the agency's definition of water supply segments, and second, acknowledge that what happens upstream affects downstream water quality. So we extend those protections to the water segments immediately above a water supply segment. Note that we rely on WQCC's classifications and so avoid having to distinguish among perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams. Finally, we propose another, although less protective avenue for carrying out the purpose and basis for Rule 411A. We use the ALA process to encourage operators and the Commission to keep oil and gas operations out of water supply segments and the segments immediately upstream from water supply segments. Thank you.
My computer's telling me I'm muted again. Love that about this computer. Thank you for that evidence and testimony. Commissioners, I know you may have questions for Ms. Walker. I might call upon AAG Minor and or Ms. Murphy if they wanted to weigh in on this whole area. And maybe you don't, I don't know. If you don't show up on the screen, that's going to mean no. Oh, Julie showed up. Hi, there you both are.
We can't resist an opportunity to talk, I don't think, Chair. I think that we've heard a lot from the parties about things around enhancing protections for water, which is maybe the big bubble I would use to describe Ms. Walker's comments on. And I think it's a place where we kind of expected to hear more on the topic in the 600 series and the conversation around setbacks. I do think, as Ms. Walker noted, that the ALA does help provide or incent siting away from these areas. But I think it's one of the areas where I kind of anticipate a fair amount of discussion, and we can get into some discussion about that now, or once we finish party presentations, if you commissioners, as you've had time to think about it, want to provide direction to staff on it, we can carry it forward.
So basically you're saying that this is where the pieces of the puzzle need to fit together correctly, and we need to have a discussion around setbacks, around protecting water with the public water system piece, and they kind of all interrelate.
That is a much more succinct summary of my long-winded, meandering discussion.
Okay. Attorney General Minor, did you want to add anything? Otherwise, I'm going to call on Commissioner Putnam.
I will perhaps only say, to build on what Director Murphy said, that there are numerous rules that are intended to protect water supplies, and Ms. Walker pointed that out, I think, in discussing both the alternative location analysis and the public water system rule. It's staff's position that Rule 411 should remain fairly focused on protections for those public water system intakes themselves, which certainly, as Director Murphy said, doesn't preclude additional discussions, perhaps in other rules about appropriate protections for some of the upstream waters or other examples of waters that are a little farther away from those public water system intakes. So I think that's staff's position. It's not that it's not an important topic to talk about. It's just that staff has sort of tried to narrowly tailor, at least at this point, and obviously you can get different direction from the Commission, 411 to be more focused on those intakes themselves.
Thank you for that, Attorney General Minor. Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think really just wanted to offer, if it's helpful to the commissioners and we can get the scheduling window, I can see if we can get Mr. Dugan or others from the Water Quality Control Division staff who work on that source water protection to address particular questions. And we'll note that there are a lot of complicated jurisdictional questions here, and there are distinctions between setbacks and what would be required for permitting under the Clean Water Act. That doesn't mean that that's not worthy of consideration. I just want to make sure that we, flag that there are some distinctions there, and we can walk through with staff, if it's helpful, the places where we see, the solid basis for providing that additional buffer protection.
Thank you for that offer, Mr. Putnam. Julie or Ms. Murphy, you'll tuck that offer in your back pocket and note it accordingly. Other questions for Ms. Walker? Commissioner McGowan, you just appeared back. Nope. Okay. I'm not seeing other questions. Going once, going twice. Sold to the highest bidder. Okay. Thank you very much for.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Go ahead.
May I just respond to what the director and AGG Minor said? I just wanted to point out that our rule is, or our proposed red lines are specifically oriented towards drinking water. We used, for example, WQCC's definition of water supply segments with the idea that those identify drinking water sources. So it's definitely, although I agree that other protections for water quality are necessary, these red lines that we propose are directed at protecting drinking water supplies.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, Ms. Walker. Appreciate that. Okay. Again, appreciate your testimony. Thanks for hanging with us late on day 7. We will allow you to be zoomed away, and we will bring in Citizens for a Healthy Community. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes.
Wonderful. Is Chris Michalski
Yep.
on deck? Because he will be presenting for us this afternoon, so I'll turn it over to him.
Great. Mr. Mikulski.
Hello, Chairman Robbins and Commissioners. It's a pleasure to speak with you all again. My name is Chris Michalski, and I serve as legal counsel for Citizens for a Healthy Community. I want to first commend staff for the inclusion of a permitting process for seismic operations in the 300 series and more robust regulations around seismic operations in the 400 series. CHC has a particular experience with seismic operations in the North Fork Valley and would be happy to answer any questions the Commission may have regarding those experiences. However, we are still deeply concerned about the disregard for site-specific geologic hazard review. While there seems to be no appetite from staff to incorporate any meaningful site-specific geologic review into the permitting process, CHC appreciates and supports Commissioner McGowan's and Nanjapa's calls for increased transparency in how the COGCC evaluates geohazards, and Commissioner Messner's proposition for a geologic hazard checkbox on the Form 2A that may trigger additional geologic hazard review. While Commissioners McGowan, Nanjapa, and Messner's suggestions are not as vigorous as needed, it is definitely a step in the right direction. The final component of our comprehensive geologic hazard rules is a seismic monitoring plan that delineates a system of seismic monitoring and reporting that can inform timely decision-making for operators and regulators. The monitoring system we propose is referred to as a traffic light system of seismic monitoring, or TLS. A TLS is not novel and is the most prevalent seismic monitoring regulatory system used around the world in places such as Canada, Europe, China, Ohio, and Oklahoma. At its most basic level, TLS sets Richter magnitude thresholds that correspond with green light, yellow light, and red light. Like a normal traffic light, green means go, yellow means slow down, and red means stop. TLS thresholds are designed to mitigate hazards before they occur. For example, the intention of a yellow light threshold is to provide room for operators to react and begin mitigation strategies to ultimately avoid a red light threshold. The intention of a red light threshold is to provide a regulatory intervention before a damaging earthquake ground motion occurs. CHC proposes that the COGCC adopt the TLS thresholds as used in the United Kingdom because they are the most protective. They allow for a risk of less than 1% damage, which would eliminate nearly all instances of adverse impacts. When discussing seismic monitoring with the author of the most recent scientific paper on TLS, Ryan Schultz, whose paper is attached as Exhibit B to our 400 series pre-hearing statement, he described our proposed seismic TLS system as a simple approach, or a one-size-fits-all approach, and informed us that a regulatory body can use a more advanced risk-based approach based on geologic risk factors. CHC proposed in its 300 series geologic rules that the operator submit site-specific geologic mapping that identifies geologic risk factors. Those maps can be used to craft TLS systems based on the on-the-ground conditions. One noted deficiency to a TLS system is that there's no agreed upon best management practices for what actions an operator should take in a yellow light threshold to avoid reaching a red light threshold. Because of that, Mr. Schultz's paper recommends setting a red light threshold 2 magnitudes above a yellow light threshold to give an operator room to act. CHC also proposes contemporaneous reporting with the TLS that is modeled after the UK's reporting system. That reporting system is more fully outlined in our proposed 400 series rule. That concludes my testimony, and we know you guys have had a long day, but we would welcome any questions.
Thank you for that testimony. Turning to commissioners, are there questions for this witness? All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Your points are pretty straightforward. Appreciate bringing those back to us as well. I believe we've given some direction on these regards, and so we'll see where we end up with this. Thank you for being here to testify this afternoon. With that, we will zoom you away and bring into the house TEP Rocky Mountain LLC as a panelist. There's Mr. Jewell. And I believe they have a 5-minute presentation for us. Mr. Jewell, are you presenting? Do you have others with you?
Just myself this afternoon, sir. Thank you.
Generally do it on your own, so we appreciate that. You can go ahead and get, are you sharing a screen?
No, sir.
All right, well, take it away.
Well, thank you again, commissioners and staff. Again, Michael Jewell, representing Terra Energy Partners and TEP Rocky Mountain LLC in this rulemaking. And once again, helping you to close down yet another day of productive hearings. Above all, thank you to staff for updating the statement of basis and purpose to assure that the particulars of Order 1-229 will remain in place. After a long collaboration on this basin-wide order in 2018, we're glad to see the new paradigm will remain and not be replaced again. Today, we offer 2 quick points to highlight for your consideration that have not yet been fully explored today. Number 1, overlapping regulations between COGCC and the BLM. And number 2, reconsidering noise restrictions in rural and remote areas. First, while the Commission's hard work in drafting the 400 series is recognized and appreciated, the draft 400 series rules do not fully appreciate the strict regulations that the BLM imposes on Western Slope operators dealing with federal lands. When operating on federal lands, operators must obtain approval of the BLM's 12-point Surface Use Plan of Operations, or SUPOs, you know how we are with the Fed and pronouncing acronyms, and a 9-point drilling plan prior to conducting any work on the location. As you've heard many times too, there's NEPA, and NEPA, of course, is comprehensive. And from that comprehensive approach, we get a lot of lease stipulations that are attached to almost every drill site that's on federal acreage in the Bmps. So you couple those lease stips with the SUPO, and you see there's a lot of overlap with what the federal government is doing, what the COGCC is proposing to do in the draft 400 series rules, particularly 423 to 427. TARA recommends that the Commission directly recognize BLM's efforts to regulate these overlapping areas and defer to BLM on these established regulations and requirements in lieu of further regulation that fails to achieve any new results. Specifically, as we did in the 300 series rulemaking, by Q1 2021, a working group comprised of the COGCC director, the BLM, TARA, other Bmps operators, and related stakeholders convened to expound the MOU in a way that creates roadmaps to efficiency for both regulating agencies. It's really a win-win for all. Again, TARA has 58% of its well sites on federal lands, and a supermajority of planned wells will probably be on federal acreage. So this is something that we believe is different from the greater Wattenberg and could help establish a better protocol moving forward. Second, TARA appreciates the goal of ensuring noise from oil and gas development does not disproportionately impact rural areas. And we join Ms. Chelsea Mira's statements about noise in the Bmps. The right approach to helping prevent and mitigate noise impacts is the least restrictive alternative that achieves the purpose of the law. The population density differences on the West Slope indicate that the standards reflecting the needs and tolerances of drilling in urban areas are neither a good fit nor the least restrictive alternative for the Bmps Basin. Therefore, TARA requests that the Commission allow the relevant local government to set noise limits by drawing population or geographically based exceptions to the proposed rule. This not only allows the party the best position to understand the needs of the local area, but also prevents conflict concerning zoning regulations near locations if new development occurs near operating units. Furthermore, we again remind the Commission that drilling in the Bmps rarely implicates the same industrial sites horizontal developments in favor of traditional vertical and directional development. The time spent drilling, the actual footprint, the associated environmental impacts, including that to wildlife, differ significantly from other basins. Therefore, TARA requests that the rural limits be removed from draft 423B1 and replaced with deference to the relevant local government to set appropriate noise levels in areas zoned rural and conforming changes throughout the rest of the series. So to conclude, number 1, please consider as requested before to revisit the MOU with the BLM by the end of Q1 2021. And number 2, consider lifting the limits in Rule 423B1 in rural areas so that noise limitations are equitable among operators. Thank you for your time. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Mr. Jewell. Apologies that you end up closing out all of our days when we may be a little more tired.
Oh, it's fine.
But we appreciate your testimony and hanging in there with us. Commissioners, at this point, we have an opportunity to ask questions of Mr. Jewell about his presentation. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Jewell, for your presentation. I'm going to build on a question that Commissioner Messner had asked earlier and was something that was on my mind as well, and that relates to impacts of noise on wildlife, especially in those rural areas where you may have more and different types of wildlife than we would in the GWA, for example. So could you comment on how your ask with respect to the noise reductions would or thresholds would be addressed when it comes to wildlife?
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. most importantly are those lease stipulations. So after NEPA, and then there's a federal bid on leases that come after that NEPA process, the lease stipulations will have identified those species that are most at risk by drilling operations. And I can tell you from working in this basin for quite a long time, a lot of these stipulations have outright bans because of the noise, particularly bald eagles and other species. So we think the goal here, as we look at the 300 series rules as well, and considering concurrent versus sequential permitting, that we really have everything on the table and we're figuring out these drilling windows that we have in the Bmps because of these wildlife restrictions and make sure we're having a win-win here.
Follow up, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Other commissioners, Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for being so late in the day. I'm wondering if the previous discussions we've been having about submitting substantially equivalent information that will help meet the requirements for things that go in front of the commission kind of helps solve the problem with what you're talking about today, where you feel that the BLM is sufficiently rigorous in their requirements and what they require an operator to do.
I'm sorry, you cut out there about the last 5 seconds. Sorry.
So I'm wondering if that discussion that we've been having doesn't kind of help mitigate the concern that you brought up about the BLM is already requiring operators to go through a pretty rigorous application.
I think what Tara is suggesting is that by looking at this MOU approach as we did in 300 series rules, we're laying the groundwork to make sure we have all those tools available. And I think until we have all interested parties doing that, including the BLM, they have such a wonderful staff with a lot of institutional knowledge, that we get this pounded out in the MOU, then we will be able to make these decisions quicker and more consistently.
Other questions from commissioners? All right, seeing none, thank you again for your testimony and for your participation, Mr. Jewell. We appreciate it. We will zoom you away from the panel and turn it back to commission and staff. I see that Director Murphy has showed back up. Nothing, okay. So we are through the agendized party presentations for today. It is 4:12. A little earlier than normal, but I would suggest to my fellow commissioners that we go ahead and break and give us a chance to get caught up. I know each of us are using our evenings to get ready for additional days work. And so this might give us a chance to, I don't know, get outside and go for a run or a hike or a walk or something before we go back to work this evening. So staff is comfortable with that. This also gives staff some chance to further get prepared for next staff presentation and for the 300 series redo, and then they're working on 500 as well. So not seeing any objection, I would look for a motion to adjourn until 9 a.m. Wednesday, September 2nd. Ha, Kyle, I finally got it.
So moved.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We're adjourned, folks. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your continued work with us on these important rulemakings.
Nice work, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.